chambers, and to fashion the 1,001 things necessary for everyday life. So great was their delight as metal workers to come upon this exhaustless supply of pure silver that they could hardly sleep until they had set up clusters of gas jets throughout these vast caverns, for, no doubt, little Baron, thou hast already guessed that this is the spot I am telling thee of, that right here it was where our people halted to build the city of silver. But one thought troubled them, and that was where to find needful clothing, for the old was fast falling into shreds and tatters, when, to their delight, they came upon a bed of mineral wool, and with this they managed to weave some cloth. Although it was rather stiff and harsh, yet it was better than none. While exploring a new cavern one day, one of my wise ancestors saw a large night moth alight near him, and, gently loosening some of its eggs, he carried them home, more as a curiosity than aught else. Imagine how rejoiced he was, however, to see one of the worms which hatched out set to work spinning a cocoon of silk half as big as his fist. There was great feasting and merry-making among our people upon hearing of this glad news, and it was not very long before many a silver shuttle was rattling in a silver loom, and the soft bodies of our people were warmly and comfortably clad. Now, long periods of time went by, which, cut up into your months, would have made many, many years. Our people had everything but sunlight, and this, of course, those who were born in the underworld knew nothing about and therefore did not miss. But, as was to be expected, great changes gradually took place in our people. To their inexpressible grief, they noticed that as they busied themselves beautifying their new homes by erecting arches and bridges and terraces, and lining them with glorious candelabra and statues, all in cast and or hammered silver, their sight was gradually failing them, and that in not a very great length of time they should be totally blind. This result, little Baron, continued the learned Barrel Brow, was very natural, for the sense of sight was in reality created for sunlight, for as thou no doubt knowest, all the fish that swim in our rivers have no eyes, having no need of them. It happened just as they had expected. In a few generations more our people discovered that thy eyes could no longer see things as thou dost, but yet they could feel them if they were not too far away, just as I can feel thy presence now and tell where thou sittest, and how tall thou art, and how broad thou art, and whether thou movest to right or left, forward or backward, but I cannot tell exactly how thou art made until I reach out and touch thee, then I know all, yes, far better than thou canst know, for our sense of feeling is keener than thy so-called sight. One of my people can feel a grain or roughness upon a silver mirror which to thy eyes seems smoother than glass. Well, strange to relate, and yet not strange, our ancestors with the going out of their sense of sight also felt their sense of hearing on the wane. Our ears, as thou callest them, having nothing more to listen to, for eternal silence, as thou knowest, reigns in this underworld, became as useless to us as the tail of the pollywog would be to the full-grown frog, and of course with the loss of our sense of hearing our children were soon unable to learn to talk, and in a certain lapse of time we came to merit full well our new name of formfolk, or and people, for we were now blind and deaf and dumb. A Sudipsi maiden reading her favourite poet. It is long, very, very long, little Baron, continued the learned Sudipsi, since all recollection of sunlight, of colour, of sound, died out of our minds. Today my people don't even know the names of these things, and thou wouldst have as much chance of success wert thou to attempt to tell them what light or sound is as thou wouldst have if thou shouldst try to explain to a savage that there is nothing under the world to hold it up, and yet it doesn't fall. But if thou shouldst lay several pieces of metal in a row and ask one of my people to tell thee what they were, he would try the weight of each and feel its grain carefully, possibly smell them or touch his tongue to them, and then he would make answer, that is gold, that is silver, that is copper, that is lead, that is tin, that is iron. But thou wouldst say, they all are differently coloured, canst not perceive that? I know not what thou meanest by colour, he would reply. But mark me, now I hide them all beneath this silken kerchief, and still by touching them with my fingertips I can tell what metal each one is. If thou canst do it, "Then art thou as good a man as I Vivat sayest now, little Baron?" asked the learned Barrel Brow, while his face was emmeathed in a smile of triumph. "Dost think thou wouldst be as good a man as this Soodopsy?" "Nay, indeed I do not, wise master," wrote I upon my silver tablet, "and I thank thee for all thou hast told me and taught me, and I ask leave, O Barrel Brow, to come again and converse with thee." "That thou mayest," little Baron traced the learned Soodopsy upon his silver tablet, and then as I turned to leave his chamber he reached quickly after me and touched me with a bent forefinger, which meant return. "Thy pardon, little Baron," he wrote, "but thou art leaving my study without thy faithful Bulger, am I not right?" I was astounded, for indeed he was right, and though without the sense of sight he had seen more than I with two good eyes wide open. There lay Bulger fast asleep on a silken-covered hassock. Our silent conversation had so wearied him that he had sailed off into the land of Nod on the wings of a dream. He hung his head and looked very shamefaced when my call aroused him and he discovered that I had actually reached the doorway without his knowing it. Chapter 19 begins with something about the little Soodopses, but branches off on another subside, to Silent Song of Singing Fingers, the fair maid of the city of Silver. Barrel Brow is kind enough to enlighten me on a certain point, and he takes occasion to pay Bulger a very high compliment, which, of course, he deserved. The longer I stayed among the Soodopses the more did I become convinced that they were the happiest, the lightest-hearted, the most contented human beings that I had met in all my travels. If it were possible for the links of a long chain suspended over a chasm to be living, thinking beings for a short while, it seems to me they would hang together in the most perfect accord, for each link would discover that he was no better than his neighbour, and that the welfare of all the other links depended upon him and his upon theirs. So it was with the formfolk. Having no sense of sight they knew no such thing as envy, and all hands were alike when reached out for a greeting. I was amazed at times to see how they could feel my approach when I would be 10 or 15 feet away from them, and I often amused myself by trying to steal by one of them in the street. But no, it was impossible, a hand would invariably be held out for a greeting. Little by little, they got over their distrust of me, and made up their minds that I had told them the truth when I said that no dancing spectre was forever following at my heels. One of the most interesting sights was to see a group of Soodopsy children at play, building houses with silver blocks, or playing a game very much like our dominoes. I noticed that they kept no tally, such wonderful memories had they that it was quite unnecessary. At first the children were so frightened upon feeling of me that they fled with terror pictured upon their little faces. Their parents explained to me that I made very much the same impression upon them as if I should feel of a person whose skin was as rough as a sea urchin's. When at last I succeeded in coaxing several of them to my side, I was astounded to see one little fellow who had by chance pressed his tiny hand against my watch pocket spring away from me terror-stricken. He had felt a tick and didn't stop running until he had reached his mother's side. His wonderful tale that the little Baron carried some strange animal around in his pocket soon caused a crowd to collect about me, and it was some time before I could persuade even the parents that the watch was not alive and that it was not the little animal's heart which they felt beating. On one occasion, when a little Soodopsy was sitting on my lap with its tiny arm twined affectionately around my neck, I happened to make some remark to Bulger, when, to my amazement, the child sprang out of my arms and darted away with a look of terror upon his little face. What had I done to him? It seems that by the merest chance his tiny hand had been pressed against my throat, and that he had been terrified by feeling the strange vibration caused by my voice. Immediately the report was spread about that the little Baron carried another little Baron around in his throat, that anyone could feel him, if I would only consent. It took me a long while to convince them that what they felt was not another little Baron, but merely the vibration caused by my expelling my breath in a way peculiar to the people of the upper world. But all the same, I was obliged to say many hundreds of useless things to Bulger in order to give their little hands a chance to feel something so wonderful. From the little I have told you about the names of the formfolk, dear friends, you have no doubt understood that their names took their rise from some physical quality, defect, or peculiarity. Besides the names I have already mentioned, I remember sharp chin, long nose, silk ears, smooth palms, big knuckle, nail off, hammer fist, soft touch, hole in cheek, or hole in chin, dimple, crooked hair, cowlick, and so on, and so on. But, to my amazement, one day, when asking the name of a young girl whose long and delicate fingers had attracted my attention, I was informed that her name was Singing Fingers, or, possibly, I might translate it Music Fingers. I had noticed that the Sudipses had some idea of music, for the children often amused themselves dancing, and, while so engaged, beat time with their fingertips on each other's cheeks or foreheads. But I was completely in the dark as to what they meant by singing fingers, or why the young girl should have been so named, hence was I greatly pleased to hear the maiden's mother ask me whether I would like to feel one of her daughter's songs, as she termed it. Upon my acquiescing, the mother approached me and proceeded to roll up the sleeves of my coat until she had laid my arms bare to the elbow, then she took my arms and clasped them across my breast one above the other. Bulger watched the proceeding with somewhat of displeasure in his eyes. He had half an idea that these silent people might play some hurtful trick upon his little master. But my smile soon disarmed his suspicion. Singing Fingers now drew near, and as her sweet face with its sightless eyes turned full upon me I could hardly keep back the tears. And yet, why grieve for anyone who seemed to be so perfectly happy? A smile played around her dainty little mouth, disclosing her tiny silvery white teeth like so many real pearls, and her bosom rose and fell quickly, sending forth a faint breathing sound. She looked so like a radiant child of some other world that before I cried out, "Speak, oh, speak, beautiful child!" In an instant she drew back affrighted, for the sudden vibration of the air had startled her, but I reached out and touched her hand to give her to understand that she need fear nothing, and then she drew near to me again. Suddenly her beautiful hands with their long, frail, delicate fingers were lifted into the air, and she began to sway her body and to wave her hands in gentle and graceful motions as if keeping time with some music. Gradually she drew nearer to me, and ever and anon her silken fingertips touched my hands or arms as if they were a keyboard, and she was about to begin to execute a soft and dainty bit of music, and I noticed that her fingers had some delightful perfume upon them. Now fast and faster the gentle taps rain upon me with rhythmic regularity. They soothe me, they thrill me, they reach my heart as if they were the sweet notes of a flute or the soft tones of a singer's voice. The maiden is really singing to me. It seems to me that I can understand what she is saying, or, rather, thinking, as her dainty fingertips fairly fly hither and thither, and I can hear her low breathing grow louder and louder. Suddenly she leaves my hands and arms and I feel her gentle tapping on my cheeks and brow. So gently, oh, so gently and soothingly her fingers touch me that at last they feel like rose leaves dragged across my face. The sensation is so delightful, so like the soft touch of sleep to weary eyes, that I drop off in good earnest, and when, after a moment or so, I opened my eyes there sat the smiling formfolk waiting for me to awake, and there stood the radiant-visaged Singing Fingers in front of me, childlike, waiting to be commended. And so you see, dear friends, that it is not so hard to be happy after all if you only set about it in the right way. The formfolk seem to have set about it in the right way, judging by results, and they are the only things we have to judge by. Some men will fish all day and not have a bite, and some people will try their whole lives to catch happiness and not get any more than a nibble. They don't use the right kind of bait. Let 'em try a kind act, a live one. There was something I wanted to ask of the learned Barrel Brow, so the next call I made on him I put this question to him: is it possible, learned master, that thy people have absolutely no guide, no overseer, no rulers? The great scholar of the formfolk ceased reading the 4 books which lay opened before him, one under each hand and one under each foot, as I handed him my silver tablet. little baron, was his reply. If there were only a bramble-bush big enough for all you people of the upper world to jump into, and if you could only get rid of your ears too, you would soon be rid of your rulers who oppress you, who prey upon you, for no one would have any desire to be a ruler if there was no one left to look at him and if he couldn't hear what the flatterers said about him. Vanity is the soil that rulers spring from, as the mushrooms spring from the rich loam of our dark caverns. I pretend that it is the exercise of power that they are so fond of. Believe them not. It is the gratification of their vanity and nothing else. If it were only in thy power to say to every man who itched to be a ruler, well and good, brother, a ruler thou shalt be, but bear in mind, weak man, that when thou hast donned thy gaudy uniform and mounted thy gaily caparisoned steed, when thou ridest at the head of troop and cavalcade with 10,000 armed men following thee on foot, as slaves their master, and the plaudits of the foolish multitude rend the air, no eye shall witness the splendor of thy triumph, no ear catch a sound of the deafening cheers. Take my word for it, little baron, no one would want to be a ruler any more. There are no rulers, little baron, continued the learned barrel brow. There can be no followers. Where there are no followers, there will be no quarrelling. When it becomes necessary in our nation, we form the great circle for deliberation. Each man writes out what he thinks on his tablet. Then the opinions are read and counted and the majority rules. But we form the great circle only in times of urgent need. Generally speaking, the smaller circles answer all the purposes. In fact, the family circle is in most cases quite sufficient. I touched First Barrel Brow's heart in token of my gratitude for the many things which he had taught me, and then the back of his head to bid him good night. You may imagine his and my delight, dear friends, when the wise Bulger raised himself upon his hind legs, and with his right paw also thanked the learned Barrel Brow, and then bade him good night by a light tap on the back of his head. Fortunate the traveller, wrote the learned Sudipsi, attended by so wise and watchful a companion. True, like a child, he goes on all fours, but by so doing he brings his heart and his brains on the same level, the only way for a man to wear them if he would do his fellow creatures any good. Trouble with thy people in the upper world, little baron, is that they think too much. They clasp minds instead of clasping hands, they send messengers with gifts instead of giving themselves. They hire people to dance for them, to sing for them, to be merry for them. I will not be satisfied until they have hired people to help them be sorry, to whom they may say, my friend is dead, I loved him. Weep 3 whole days for him. Chapter 20. This is a long and a sad chapter. It tells how dear, gentle, Pouting Lip was lost, and how the Sudipses grieved for him and whom they suspected. Bulger gives a striking proof of his wonderful intelligence, which enables me to convince the Sudipses that my dancing spectre did not cause Pouting Lip's death. The true tale of his terrible fate. What follows my discovery. How a beautiful boat is built for me by the grateful Sudipses, and how Bulger and one bid adieu to the Lani, of the make believe eyes. 'Twas the custom in the city of silver to touch all around, as it was called, before going to rest. The touch all around began in a certain quarter of the city and passed with wonderful rapidity from man to man. Exactly how it was done I never could understand, but the purpose of the mysterious signalling was to make an actual count of all the form folk. If a single one were missing, it would be most surely discovered by the time the touch all around had been completed. It proceeded with lightning-like rapidity throughout the city, and then, if no return signal was made, the people knew that everyone was in his proper place, that no Sudipsi had lost his way or fallen ill in some unfrequented passage. I don't think that I had more than dropped off to sleep when I was aroused by Bulger's gentle tugging at my sleeve. Rubbing my eyes, I sat up in bed and listened. Instantly my ear caught that faint, shuffling sound which was always perceptible when any number of the formfolk were hurrying hither and thither over the polished silver pavement. I sprang out of bed and rushed to the door, Bulger close at my heels. Vivid a strange sight confronted me. I could compare it to nothing save to the appearance of a large ant-hill when some mischievous boy suddenly drops a stone among the crowd of petty, patient, plodding people peacefully pursuing their work. In an instant all is changed, lines are broken, workmen jostle workmen, order becomes disorder, regularity is changed to confusion. Hither and thither the affrighted creatures rush with waving feelers, seeking for the cause of the mad outburst of terror. So it was with the formfolk as I looked out upon them. With outstretched hands and tremulously moving fingers they rushed from side to side, jostling and bumping one another, while a nameless dread was depicted upon their upturned faces. Anon a group would halt, join hands, and begin to exchange thoughts by lightning-like pressures, tappings, and strokes, when others would dash against them, break them apart, and confusion would reign greater than ever. But gradually I noted that some sort of order seemed to be coming out of the movements of this mad throng. Here and there groups of 3 and 4 would form and clasp hands, then these smaller circles would break and form into larger ones, and I noted too that this ever-increasing circle was formed on the outside of the panic-stricken crowd, and as it grew it shut them in so that when a fleeing Sudipsi hurtled up against this steady line, his terror left him at once and he took his place in it. In a few moments the madly pushing, jostling throng had disappeared entirely and the whole city was girt round about by these long, steady lines. The great circle had been formed. After half an hour the deliberation was completed, and, to my surprise, the great circle broke up into squads and companies of 4s and 6s and 10s, and then each disappeared slowly and steadily with lockstep, passing out of the city into the dark or only partially lighted chambers and passages that surrounded it. The search for the missing Sudipsi had been begun. The gigantic tortoise that devoured Pouting Lip. It was hours before the last squad had returned to the square and the great circle had been formed again. Alas! The news was sad indeed. There came no tidings of the missing man. He was lost forever, and with clasped hands and slow and heavy step the grieving formfolk made their way back to their homes, where the sighing women and children were awaiting their coming. As Bulger and I went back to bed again, it almost seemed to me as if I could hear at times the deep and long-drawn sighs that escaped from the gentle breasts of the sorrowing Sudipsis. I noticed a very touching thing on the following day. It was that every man, woman, and child in the city of silver grieved for the lost Sudipsi as if he were actually brother to each of them. Love was not as with us, in the upper world, a thing bestowed upon those in whom we see our own faces repeated and in whose voices we heard our own ring out again, sweet and clear as in our childhood, in other words, a love almost of our very selves. Oh, no. While it was true that a mother's touch was most tender to her own child, yet no little hand stretched out to her went without its caress. She was mother to them all, to her they were all beautiful, and as their little frocks were all woven in the same loom, there never could come into her mind a temptation to feel whether a rich neighbour's child was playing with hers, and that therefore it ought to receive a more loving caress. In that portion of the city where the children had their playgrounds the silver pavement was in some places marked off with raised lines and letters, something after the manner of our hopscotch, for the purpose of a game which was very popular with the little Sudipsis. Its name is hard to translate, but it meant something like Little Bowman, and many an hour had Bulger and I stood there watching these silent little gnomes at play, fascinated by the wonderful skill which they would display in feigning the drawing near of the little Bogeyman, their hiding from him, his stealthy approach, the increasing danger, the attack, the escape, the new dangers, wild flight, and mad pursuit. Fancy, therefore, my astonishment one morning to note that Bulger was coaxing me thither, although the place was quite deserted, the children being all at their lessons. But, as it was a rule of mine always to humour Bulger's whims, I went patiently along. In a moment, as we came to the spot where the pavement was marked off and inscribed as I have explained, he halted and with an anxious whine began to play the game of the little Bogeyman, turning every now and then to see what effect his actions had upon me. He made no mistakes. As he entered each compartment, He rested his paw upon the raised letters as he had so often seen the children do with their little bare feet, and then mimicked with wonderful fidelity their actions, beginning with the first scent of danger and ending with mad terror at the close pursuit of the bogeyman. I was more than surprised, I was bewildered by this piece of mimicry on Bulger's part. To my mind it boded some terrible accident to him, for I have a superstitious notion that great danger to an animal's life gives him for the moment an almost human intelligence. It is nature caring for her own. But all of a sudden the real truth in this case burst upon me. It was not my dear little brother giving me to understand that some peril was threatening him, but that some danger was hanging over my head, the more real in that it was unseen and unsuspected by me. I called him to me and rewarded him with a caress. He was overjoyed to note that I had apparently understood him. I now made haste to seek out Barrel Brow. He was surprised to feel my salutation. In a moment or so I had told him all. Nor was he slow in detecting my excitement. He, no doubt, felt that in the changed character of my handwriting. Calm thyself, little Baron, he mote. The wise Bulger has told thee the truth. Thy life is in danger. I had resolved to send for thee this very day to warn thee of it, to bid thee quit the land of the formfolk in all haste, for the notion has spread among our people that it was the dancing spectre at thy heels which caused the death of the gentle pouting lip, who disappeared so mysteriously the other day. It therefore counsel thee that thou make ready at once and quit our city tomorrow before the clocks rouse the people from their sleep. I thanked Barrel Brow, and promised that I would heed his advice, although I confessed to him that I would fain have bided a few weeks longer. There were so many things in and about the wonderful city of silver that I had not seen. But I owed it to the dear hearts of my own world to take the best care of my life, insignificant though it might appear to me. Then, again, I felt that it would be madness to attempt to reason with the Sudipses. To them the dancing spectre at my heels was a real being of flesh and blood, although they had not been able to seize him, and it was really natural for them to suspect that we had made away with Pouting Lip. Calling out to Bulger to follow me, I left Barrel Brow's home, resolved to make one more round of the wonderful city, and then pack up some food and clothing and be all ready for a start before the clocks began their tapping. I should explain, dear friends, that, as happens in all cities, the people of this one imagined at times that they hadn't quite elbow room enough, and hence they surveyed other chambers, and set up new candelabra within them, in order to chase the cold and dampness away, and make them fit for human habitations. In the last one which they had in this way annexed to their fair city, fitting it with a silver doorway and tiling the floor with polished plates of the same beautiful metal, they had discovered a hard mound apparently of rock in one corner, and had resolved that they would come some day with their drills and picks and begin the task of removing this mound. A strange inclination came upon me to visit this new chamber in order to inspect the work of these eyeless workmen, and see how far they had proceeded with their task of transforming a cold and rocky vault into a bright, warm, healthy habitation. Imagine my surprise to hear Bulger utter "I-O" growl as we reached the entrance, and I put out my hand to swing the door open, for the Sudipses were not at work there that day, and the place was as silent as a tomb. Glancing through the grating, a sight met my gaze which caused my flesh to creep and my hair to stiffen. What think ye was it? Why, the mound in the corner was rocking and swaying, and from underneath one end issued a loud and angry hissing. I'm no coward, if I do say it myself, but this was just a little too much for ordinary or even extraordinary flesh to bear without flinching. I staggered back with a suppressed cry of horror, and was upon the point of breaking into a mad flight, when the thought flashed through my mind that the door was securely fastened, and that there would be no danger in my taking another look at the terrible monster thus caged in this chamber. A great snake-like head was now lifted from beneath one edge of the mound, on the end of a long, swaying neck. Its great round eyes, big as an ox's, stared with a dull, cold, glassy look from wall to wall, and then, with an awful outburst of hissing, the whole mound was suddenly raised upon four great legs, thick as posts, and ending in terrible claws, and borne rocking and swaying into the centre of the chamber. was this terrible monster, and where had it come from? VVHY, I saw through it all now at a glance. It was a gigantic tortoise, 8 feet long by 5 wide, at least, and once an inhabitant of the upper world. Thousands and thousands of years ago, by the coming of the awful fields of ice, it had been forced to fly from certain death by crawling down into these underground caverns. Here, chilled and numbed by the dampness and cold, it had fallen asleep, and would have continued to sleep on for other ages to come, had not the industrious formfolk lighted the clusters of burning jets of gas in the monster's bedroom. Gradually the warmth had penetrated the roof of shell made thicker by earth and layers of broken rock, which the tooth of time had dropped upon it, and reached his great heart, and set it beating again slowly, very slowly, but faster and faster, until he really felt that he had awakened from his long sleep. By a terrible misfortune, Pouting Lip, the gentle Sudipsi, had happened to be left behind when his brother labourers quit work, and the new silver doors of the chamber had been closed upon him. Oh, it was terrible to think of, but true it must have been, the poor little Sudipsi, shut in by his own eyeless folk in this chamber, which he was helping to beautify by his patient skill, had served to satisfy the hunger of this awful monster, after his long ages of fasting. But why, you ask, dear friends, was all this not discovered when the great circle had been formed, and the search was made for him? Simply because the monster, after devouring the lost Sudipsi, retreated to his nest and drew the dirt and crumbled rock up around him with his gigantic flippers, and went to sleep again, as all gorged reptiles do, so that when the searchers entered the new chamber all was as they had left it, the mound of rock, as they had supposed it to be, in the corner undisturbed. With Bulger at my heels I now turned and ran with such mad haste to Barrel Brows, that the whole city was thrown into the wildest disorder, for, of course, they had felt me fly past them. With all the quickness I could command, I wrote an account of what I had witnessed, and when Barrel Brow communicated it to the assembled Sudipses, 1,000 hands flew into the air, in token of mingled fright and wonder, and a wild rush was made for Bulger and me, and we were well nigh smothered with kisses and caresses. The moment the excitement had quieted down a little, a great circle was immediately formed, and I was honoured with a place in it, and when my tablet was passed about, 1,000 hands made signs of assent. My plan was a simple one, it was to make a pipe connection between Up Haslock and the new chamber, and to turn the deadly vapour into the sleeping apartment of the gigantic monster. In this manner his dispatch would be a happy one, merely a beginning of another one of his long naps, so far as he would know anything about it. This was done at once, care first being taken to make the doors of the new chamber perfectly airtight. I was the first to enter the cavern after the execution of the monster, and found, to my delight, that my estimate of his length and width was correct almost to an inch. I always had a wonderful eye for dimension and distances. Seeing Bulger raising himself upon his hind legs, and make an effort to dislodge something from the wall, I drew near to assist him. Alas! It was dear, gentle, Pouting Lip's tablet. He had been writing upon it, and as the terrible monster advanced upon him, he had reached up and hung it upon a silver pin on the wall. Even the Sudipses read what their poor brother had written. There they all sat down and wrung their hands in silent but awful grief. It ran as follows: O my people! Why have ye abandoned me? The air trembles, the whole place is filled with suffocating odour. Must I die? Alas, I fear it. And yet I would so love to feel my dear one's touches once more. The ground trembles, a stifling breath is puffed into my face, I am wearied, almost fainting, by trying to escape it. I can write no more. Don't grieve too long over me. It was my fault. I stayed behind, when I should have followed. Oh, horrible, horrible. Farewell. I'm going now. A loving touch to all, farewell. After waiting a few days for the grief of the formfolk to lighten a little, I asked them to send a number of their most skillful workmen to assist me in removing the magnificent shell from the dead monster whose body was fed to the fishes. They not only did this, but they also offered to transform the shell into a beautiful boat for me, so that when I resolved to bid them adieu, I might sail away from the city of silver and not be obliged to trudge along the marble highway. The work went on apace. At first the polishers began their task, and in a few days the mighty carapace glowed like a lady's comb. Then the dainty and cunning craftsmen in silver began their part of the work, and ere many days the shell was fitted with a silver prow curiously wrought, like a swan's neck and head, while quaintly carved trimmings ran here and there, and a dainty pair of silver sculls with a silver rudder, beautifully chased, from which ran 2 little silken ropes, were added to the outfit. I never had seen anything half so rich and rare, and I was as proud of it as a young king of his throne before he finds it is so much like my ship of shell. At last the day came when I was to bid the gentle Pseudopses a long farewell. They lined the shore as Bulger and I proceeded to take our place in the bark of shell which sat upon the water like a thing of life. It was with a great show of dignity that Bulger took his position in the stern with the tiller ropes in his mouth, ready to pull on either side as I might direct, and setting the silver oars in place, I threw my weight upon them, and away we glided, swiftly and noiselessly, over the surface of the dark and sluggish stream. In a few moments nothing but a faint glimmer was left to remind us of the wonderful city of silver, where the silent form folk live and love and labour without ever thought that human beings could be any happier than they. Dear, happy folk, they have solved a mighty problem which we of the upper world are still struggling over. Chapter 21. How we were lighted on our way down the dark and silent river. Sudden and fierce onslaught upon our beautiful boat of shell. A fight for life against terrible odds, and how Bulger stood by me through it all. Cold air and lumps of ice. Our entry into the cavern whence they came. The boat of shell comes to the end of its voyage. Sunlight in the world within a world, and all about the wonderful window through which it poured, and the mysterious Lani, it lighted. I dare say, dear friends, that you are puzzling your brains to think out how it was possible for me to row away from the wonderful city of the formfolk without running our boat continually ashore. Ah, you forget that the keen-eyed Bulger was at the helm, and that it was not the first time that he had piloted me through darkness impenetrable to my eyes, but more than this, I soon discovered that the plashing of my silver oars kept my little friends, the fire lizards, in a constant state of alarm, and although I couldn't hear the crackling of their tails, yet the tiny flashes of light served to outline the shore admirably. So I pulled away with a will, and down this dark and silent river, for there was a current, although hardly perceptible, Bulger and I were borne along in the beautiful bark of tortoise shell with its prow of carved and burnished silver. During my sojourn in the land of the Pseudopses I had one day, while calling upon the learned Barrel Brow, noticed a beautifully carved silver hand lamp of the Pompeian pattern among his curiosities. I asked him if he knew what it was. He replied that he did, adding that it had doubtless been brought from the upper world by his people, and he begged me to accept it as a keepsake. I did so, and upon leaving the city of silver, I filled it with fish oil and fitted a silken wick to it. It was well that I had done so, for after a while the fire lizards disappeared entirely, and Bulger and I would have been left in total darkness, had I not drawn forth my beautiful silver lamp, lighted it, and suspended it from the beak of the silver swan which curved its graceful neck above the bow of our boat. After lying on my oars long enough to set some food before Bulger and partake of some myself, I again started on my voyage down the silent river, no longer shrouded in impenetrable gloom. I had not taken over 6 strokes, when suddenly one of my oars was almost twisted out of my hand by a vicious tug, from some inhabitant of these dark and sluggish waters. I resolved to quicken my stroke in order to escape another such a wrench, for the silver oars fashioned by the Pseudopses for me were of very delicate make, intended only for very gentle usage. Suddenly another vicious snap was made at my other oar, and this time the animal succeeded in retaining its hold, for I dared not attempt to wrench the oar out of its grip, for fear of breaking it. It was a large crustacean of the crab family, and its milk-white shell gave it a ghost-like look as it struggled about in the black waters, fiercely intent to keep its hold upon the oar. The next instant a similar creature had fastened firmly upon my other oar, and there I sat utterly helpless. But worse than this, the dark waters were now fairly alive with these white armoured guards of this underworld stream, each apparently bent upon setting an immediate end to my progress through their domain. They now began a series of furious efforts to lay hold of the sides of my boat with their huge claws, but happily its polished surface made this impossible for them to accomplish. Up to this moment Bulger had not stirred a muscle or uttered a sound, but now a sharp growl from him told me that something serious had happened at his end of the boat. It was serious indeed, for several of the largest of the fierce crustaceans had laid hold of the rudder and were wrenching it from side to side as if to tear it off. Every attempt of course caused a tug at the tiller ropes held between Bulger's teeth, but, bracing himself firmly, he resisted their furious efforts as well as he could, and succeeded in saving the rudder for the time being. All of a sudden our frail bark of shell crashed into some sort of obstruction, and came to a dead standstill. Peering into the darkness, to my horror I saw that the wily enemy had spanned the river with chains made up of living links by each laying hold of his neighbour's claw, the chain thus formed being then rendered almost as strong as steel by the interweaving of their double rows of small hooked legs. Our advance was not only blocked, but death, an awful death, seemed to be staring us in the face, for what possible hope of escape could there be if Bulger and I should leap into the water, now alive with these fast-swimming creatures, whirling their huge claws about in search for some way to get at us. From the brave manner in which Bulger was holding the madly swinging helm, I saw that he was determined not to surrender. But alas, bravery is but a sorry thing for two to fight 1,000 with. And yet I had not lost my head, don't think that. True, I was hard pressed, the very dust of the balance, if thicker on their side, might make my scale kick the beam. I had hauled both oars into the boat by reaching over and beating off the claws fastened upon them, and had up to this moment driven back every one of the fierce creatures which had succeeded in throwing one of his claws over the edge of the boat. But now, to my horror, I felt that our little craft was being slowly but surely drawn stern first toward the river bank. In order to accomplish this, the crustaceans had thrown out a line composed of their bodies gripped together, and had made it fast to the rudder. Not an instant was to be lost. Once upon the river bank, the fierce creatures would swarm around us by the tens of thousands, drag us down, pinch us to death, and tear us piecemeal. Sailing away from the land of the Sudipses. An idea flashed upon me, it was this: it is folly to attempt to resist these countless swarms of crustaceans by the use of one pair of weak hands, even though they be aided by Bulger's keen and willing teeth. We should, after a brief struggle, go down as the brave man in the sewer went down, when the famished rats leaped upon him from every side at once, or as the stray buffalo goes down when the pack of ravenous wolves closes up its circle about him. If I am to save my life, it must be by striking a blow that will reach every one of these small but fierce enemies at the same instant, and thus paralyze them, or, at least, bewilder them, until I can succeed in making my escape. Quickly drawing my brace of pistols, I held their muzzles close to the water, and discharged them at the same instant. The effect was terrific. Like a crash of a terrible thunderbolt, the report burst forth and echoed through these vast and silent chambers, until it seemed as if the great vaulted roof of rock had by some awful convulsion of nature been cast roaring and rattling down upon the face of these black and sluggish waters. Then the smoke had cleared away, a strange but welcome sight met my gaze. Tens of thousands of the huge crabs floated lifeless upon the surface of the river, with their shells split by the concussion the full length of their bodies. It proved to have been a masterly stroke on my part, and, dear friends, you will believe me when I tell you that I drew a deep breath as I set my silver oars against the thole pins, and, having worked my boat clear of the swarms of stunned crustaceans, rowed away for dear life. Dear life. Ah, yes, dear life, for whose life is not dear to him, even though it be dark and gloomy at times? Is there not always something, or someone, to live for? Is there not always a glimmer of hope that the morrow's sun will go up brighter than it did this morning? Well, anyway, I repeat that I rowed away for dear life, while Bulger held the tiller ropes and kept our frail bark of polished shell in the middle of the stream. Whether the air was actually colder, or whether it was merely the natural chill that so often strikes the human heart after it has been beating and throbbing with alternate hope and fear, I couldn't say at the time, but I knew this much, that I suddenly found myself suffering from the cold. For the first time since my descent into the world within a world, the air nipped my fingertips, that soft, balmy, June-like atmosphere was gone, and I made haste to put on my fur-trimmed top coat, which I had not made much use of lately. At that moment one of my oars struck against some hard substance floating in the waters. I put out my hand to feel of it. To my great surprise it proved to be a lump of ice, and very soon another and another went floating by us. We were most surely entering a region where it was cold enough to make ice. I was not sorry for this, for, to tell the truth, Bulger and I were both beginning to feel the effects of our long sojourn in the rocky chambers of this underworld, whose atmosphere, though soft and warm, yet lacked the elasticity of the open air. Ice caverns would be a complete change, and the cold air would, no doubt, send our blood tingling through our veins just as if we were out a-sleighing in the upper world on a winter's night, when the stars twinkle over our heads and the snow crystals creak beneath our runners. Soon now huge icicles began to dot the roof of rock that spanned the river, and shafts and columns of ice dimly visible along the shore seemed to be standing there like silent sentries, watching our boat as it threaded its way through the ever-narrowing channel. And now, too, a faint glow of light reached us from I knew not where, so that by straining my eyes I could see that the river had taken a sweep, and entered a vast cavern with roof and walls of ice fretted and carved into fantastic depths and niches and shelves and cornices, with here and there shapes so fanciful that it seemed to me I had entered some vast hall of statuary, where hero and warrior, nymph and maiden, shepherd and bird-catcher, filled these shelves and niches in glorious array. Farther advance by water was impossible, for the blocks of ice, knitted together like a floe, closed the river completely. I therefore determined to make a landing, draw my boat upon the shore, and continue my journey on foot. The mysterious light which up to this moment had shed its pale glimmer like an Arctic night upon the roofs and walls of ice of these silent chambers now began to strengthen so that Bulger and I had no difficulty in picking our way along the shore. In fact, we crossed and recrossed the river itself when the whim seized us, for it now went winding on ahead of us, like a broad ribbon of ice through caverns and corridors. Suddenly I came to a halt and stood as motionless as the fantastic forms of ice surrounding me. What could it mean? Were my eyes weakened by my long sojourn in the world within a world, playing me cruel tricks? Surely there can be no mistake. I whispered to myself. That light yonder which pours its glorious effulgence upon those spires and pinnacles, those towers and turrets of ice, is the sunshine of the upper world. Can it be that my marvellous underground journey is ended, that I stand upon the threshold of the upper world once more? Bulger, too, recognizes this flood of sunshine, and breaking out into a fit of joyous barking, dashes on ahead, to be the first one to feel its gentle warmth after our long journey through the dark and silent passages of the world within a world. But I dare not trust my eyes, and fearing lest he should fall into some ambush or meet with some dread accident, I called him back to me. Together we hurry along as rapidly as possible. Now I note that we are drawing near to the end of the vast corridor through which we have been making our way for some time, and that we stand upon the portal of a mighty subterranean region lighted with real sunlight. It stretches away as far as the eye can reach, and so high is the roof that spans this vast underworld that I cannot see whether it be of ice or not. All that I can see is that through one of its sloping sides there streams a mighty torrent of sunlight, which pours its splendor with unstinting hand upon the wide highways, the broad terraces, the sheer parapets, and the sloping banks which diversify this ice world. Can it be that one side of this mighty mountain which nature has here hollowed out and set like a peaked roof over this vast subterranean region, is a gigantic window of ice itself through which the sunlight of the outer world streams in this grand way like a silent cataract of light, like a deluge of sunshine? No, this could not be, for now upon a second look I saw that this flood of light thus streaming through the side of the mountain came through it like a mighty pencil of rays, and striking the opposite walls with its brilliancy 100-fold increased, rebounded in 1,000 directions, flooding the whole region with its effulgence and dying away in faint and pearl-like glimmer in the vast approach where I had first noted it. And therefore I understood that nature must have set a gigantic lens, twice 1,000 feet or more in diameter, in the sloping side of this hollow mountain, a perfect lens of purest rock crystal, which, gathering in its mysterious bosom the sunlight of the outer world, threw it, intensely radiant and dazzling white, into the gloomy depths of this world within a world, so that when the sun went up out there, it went up in here as well, but became cold as it was beautiful, bringing no warmth, no other cheer save light, to this subterranean region which for thousands of centuries had been locked in the crystal embrace of frozen lakes and brooks and rivers and torrents and waterfalls, once bubbling and flowing and rushing headlong through fair lands of the upper world, but suddenly checked in their course by some bursting forth of mighty pent-up forces, and turned downward into these icy depths condemned to everlasting rest and silence, their crystals locked in a sleep that never would know an awaking, mocked in their dreams by this mysterious sunlight that came with the smile and the fair, winsome look of the ray owl, and yet was so powerless to set them free as once it did when the springtime came in the upper world. All these thoughts and many others besides flitted through my mind as I stood looking up at that mighty lens in its setting of mightier rock. And so deeply impressed was I by the sight of such a great flood of sunlight pouring through this gigantic bull's eye which nature had set in the rocky side of the hollow mountain peak and illumining this underworld, that the longer I gazed upon the wonderful spectacle the more firmly enthralled my senses became by it. The deep silence, the deliciously pure air, the ever-varying tints of the light as the mighty ice columns acting the part of prisms, literally filled those vast chambers with the rainbow's glorious glow, imparted unto the spell resting upon me such unearthly power that it might have held me there until my limbs hardened into icy crystals and my eyes looked out with a frozen stare, had not the ever-watchful Bulger given a gentle tug at the skirt of my coat and aroused me from my enthralling meditation. Chapter 22. The palace of ice in the golden sunlight, and what one imagined it might contain. How we were halted by a couple of quaintly clad sentinels. The Coltiquerps. His frigid majesty King Gelidus. More about the ice palace, together with a description of the throne room. Our reception by the king and his daughter Schneeball. Brief mention of Bully Brain, or Lord Hothead. Scarcely had I advanced 100 yards beyond the portal where I had halted when, happening to turn my eyes to the other side, a sight met them which sent a thrill of wonder and delight through my form. There upon the highest terrace stood a palace of ice, its slender minarets, its high-lifted towers, its rounded turrets, its spacious platform, and its broad flights of steps all glittering in the sunlight as if gem-studded and jewel-set. It was a spectacle to stir the most indifferent heart, let alone one so full of ardour and buoyancy as mine. But dear friends, even admitting that I can succeed in awakening in your minds even a faint conception of the beauty of this ice palace, as the sunlight fell full upon it at that moment, how can I ever hope to give you an idea of the unearthly beauty of this palace of ice and its glorious surroundings when the moon went up in the outer world at a later hour and its pale, mysterious light was poured through the mighty lens in the mountain side, and fell with celestial shimmer upon these walls of ice? But the one thought that oppressed me now was, can this beautiful abode be without a tenant, without a living soul within its wonderful halls and chambers? Or, may not its dwellers, overtaken by the pitiless cold, sit with wide-opened eyes and icy glare, stark as marble in chairs of ice, white frosted hair pressed against icy cushions, and hands stiffened around crystal cups filled with frozen wine of topaz hue, while the harper's fingers cling cramped to the wires stiff as the wires themselves, and the last tones of the singer's voice lie in feathery crystals of frozen breath white at his feet? Come what may, I resolved to lift the crystal knocker that might hang on the outer door of this palace of ice and awaken the castellan, if his slumber were not that of death. In a few moments I had crossed the level space between me and the first terrace, which it would be necessary for me to scale in order to reach the second and then the third, upon which stood the palace of ice. Imagine my more than surprise upon finding myself now at the foot of a magnificent flight of steps, hewn into the ice with a master hand, and leading to the terrace above. Springing lightly up this flight with Bulger close at my heels, I suddenly set eyes upon two of the quaintest-looking human beings that I ever remembered seeing in all my travels. They looked for all the world like two big animated snowballs, being clad from top to toe in garments made of snow-white fleece, their skull caps likewise of white fur, leaving only their faces visible. In his right hand each of them carried a very prettily shaped flint axe, mounted upon a helve of polished bone. Striding up to me and swinging their axes over my head in altogether too close proximity to my pole to be particularly pleasant, one of them cries out, "Halt, sir! Unless his frigid majesty Gelidus, king of the Coltic Werps, awaits thy coming, his guards will, at a signal from us, roll a few thousand tons of ice down upon thee if thou darest proceed another step. Will herefore, stand fast and tell us who thou art and whether thou art expected." "Gentlemen," said I, "kindly lower those axes of yours and I will convince you that his frigid majesty hath nothing to dread in me, for I am none other than the very small but very noble and very famous Sebastian von Trump, commonly known as Little Baron Trump." "Never heard of thee in all my life," said both of the guards as with one voice. "But I have of you, gentlemen," I continued, for now I recollected what the learned Don Fum had said about the frozen land of the Coltic Werps, or cold bodies, and as proof of my peaceful intent, like a true knight I now offer you my hand, and beg that you will conduct me into the presence of his frigid majesty. No sooner had the guard standing next me drawn off his glove and grasped my hand, than he let it loose again with a cry of fright. "Zounds! Man, art thou on fire? VVHY, thy hand burned me like the flame of a lamp." "Why, no, my friend," said I quietly, "that's my ordinary temperature." "And thy companion?" "Hath even a warmer heart than I have," was my reply. "Well, our word for it, little Baron," exclaimed one of the guards with a chuckle, "there will be no place for thee except in the meat quarry. Possibly after thou hast been cooled off for a week or so, his frigid majesty will be able to have thee about." This was not a very cheerful prospect, for I had no particular desire to be laid away in the royal ice box for a week or so. Anyway, the only thing to be done was to insist upon being conducted at once into the presence of the king of the Coltic Werps, and abide by his decision. One of the guards, having saluted me by presenting his battle-axe in real military style, faced about and began to ascend the grand staircase with intent to announce my arrival to his frigid majesty, while the other informed me that he would conduct me as far as the perron of the palace. I was wonderstruck with the beauty of the three staircases leading up to the ice palace. Massive balustrades with curiously carved balusters springing from towering pedestals, crowned with beautiful lamps, all and everything, to the crystal clear sides of the lamps hemselves, was fashioned from blocks of ice. It proved to be a good climb to the top of the third terrace, and I was not put out when the guard solemnly lowered his battle-axe of flint to bring me to a standstill. The sun in the upper world was, no doubt, nearing the horizon, for a deep and beautiful twilight suddenly sank upon the icy dominions of King Gelidus, and, to my surprise and delight, through the great slabs of crystal-clear ice which served for windows to the palace, streamed a soft radiance as if 1,000 wax tapers were burning in the chambers and galleries indoors. It was a sight to gladden the eyes of any mortal, but if I had been spellbound by the beauty of its exterior, how shall I tell you, dear friends, of the curious splendor of the interior of Gelidus' Palace of Ice, as it burst upon me when I had crossed its threshold? Hallway led into hallway, chamber opened into chamber, through portals gracefully arched, and winding staircases climbed to upper rooms, while hanging from lofty ceilings or resting on graceful pedestals, were 1,000 alabaster lamps, shedding light and perfume upon this glorious home of His Frigid Majesty Gelidus, King of the Coltiquerps. Long rows of retainers, all in snow-white fur, lined the wide hallway, as the guards conducted Bulger and me into the palace and bowed in silence as we passed. To my more than wonder, I saw that the inner rooms were most sumptuously furnished, chairs and divans being scattered here and there, all covered with superb skins of white fur, while the floor, too, was carpeted with them, and as the soft radiance of the alabaster lamps fell upon these magnificent pelts and set 10,000 jewels in the walls and ceilings of ice, I was ready to admit that I had never seen anything half so beautiful. And yet I was still outside the throne room of His Frigid Majesty. At length we came to one end of a broad hallway which seemed shut off from the rest of the palace by a wall thickly encrusted with strings of great diamonds, each as big as a goose egg, extending from the ceiling to the floor, and turning back the shimmer of the lamps with such a flood of crystalline radiance that my eyes involuntarily closed before it. Think of my amazement when the two guards, laying hold of this wall of jewels, as I deemed it, drew it to the right and left till there was room for me to pass. What I had taken for a wall of jewels was but a curtain made up of round bits of ice strung upon strings and hanging like a shower of diamonds there before me, as they glittered in the light of lamps each side of them. I now stood in the throne room of His Frigid Majesty, the King of the Coltiquerps. Now I realized that what I had seen elsewhere in his palace of ice was in reality but a sample of its magnificence, for here the splendor of King Gelidus' castle burst upon me in its fullest strength. Imagine a great round chamber lighted with the soft flames of perfumed oil, streaming from 100 alabaster lamps, the walls lined with broad divans covered with snow-white pelts, the floors thickly carpeted with the same glorious rugs, while on one side, glittering in the shimmer of the 100 massive lamps, stands the icy throne of the King of the Coltiquerps, decked with snow-white skins, and he upon it, with Schneebaul, his fair daughter, sitting at his feet, and all around and about him, group-wise, 100 Coltiquerps, the king, the princess, and the courtiers all clad in skins whiter than the driven snow, and you, dear friends, will have some faint idea of the splendor of the scene which burst upon me as the two guards drew aside the strands of ice jewels at the end of the hallway in the palace of ice. Like all his subjects, King Gelidus looked out through the round window of his fur hood, just as a big good-natured boy does through his skating cap. The battle for life with the white crabs. The Coltiquerps were not much taller than I, but were very stocky built, so that when broadened out by their thick fur suits they really took on at times the appearance of animated snowballs. It would be hard for the fingers of the deftest hand to draw faces fuller of kindliness and good nature than those of the Coltiquerps. Small, honest grey eyes sparkled with a boniform glint, and so broad were their smiles that they were only about half visible through the round holes of their fur hoods. I was delighted with them from the very start, and the more so when I heard King Gelidus cry out in a cheery voice, "A right crisp and cold welcome to our icy court, little baron, but from what our people tell us, thou carriest a pair of hands so hot that we beg thee to take a few days to cool off before thou to shayest palms with any of the Coltiquerps, and we also beg thee to be careful and not to lean against any of our richly carved panels, or to slide down any of our highly polished railings, or to handle the strands of our jewels, or sit down for any length of time on the front steps of our palace. And we make the same request of thy four-footed companion, who is said to be of even a warmer disposition than thou." I bowed and kissed my hand to His Frigid Majesty, and assured him that I should make every effort to lower my temperature as speedily as possible, and, in the meantime, that I should be extremely careful not to come into contact with any of the artistic carving of his palace of ice. As I pronounced these words, the whole company began to clap their hands, and as they did so, a cold shiver ran down my back, for there was a sound, without, very much like the rattling of dry bones to that applause, but I took good care not to let King Gelidus notice my fright. His frigid Majesty now presented me to his daughter Schneebaul, a pretty little maid of about 16 crystal winters, with cheeks round as apples, and as deeply dimpled as the furrows of a crossbun. Her eyes twinkled as she looked upon Bulger and me, and turning to her frigid papa, she asked for leave to touch the tip end of my thumb, which being done, she gave a squeaky little scream and began to blow on her tiny finger as if I had blistered it. King Gelidus also presented me to several of his court favourites, all men of the coldest blood in the nation. Their names were Gelikin, Frostifis, Icicle, and Glaciobhoi. They were all dreadfully slow thinkers when you questioned them very closely upon any subject. It didn't take me very long to discover this. In fact, they requested me to be less warm in my manner, and not to ask them any poses, as they invariably found that deep thought caused a rise in their temperature. This was, to be honest about it, very annoying to me, for you know, dear friends, what a lodestone my mind is, never asleep, always in a quiver like a mariner's compass, pointing this way and that, in search of the polar star of wisdom. Upon making known my trouble to his frigid Majesty, King Gelidus, he most gracefully ordered one of his trusty attendants to conduct me to the triple-walled ice cell of a certain coltiquerp by the name of Bully Brain, that is, literally, boiling brain, a man who had been born with a hot head, and consequently with a very active brain. For 50 years King Gelidus had been doing his very best to refrigerate this subject of his, but without success. As I was just bursting with impatience to ask a whole string of questions concerning the coltiquerps, you may imagine how delighted I was to make the acquaintance of Bully Brain, or Lord Hothead as he was called among the coltiquerps. But, dear friends, you must excuse me if I make this the end of a chapter and stop here for a brief rest. Chapter 23. Lord Hothead again, and, this time a fuller account of him. His wondrous tales concerning the coltiquerps, where they came from, who they were, and how they managed to live in this world of eternal frost. The many questions one put to him, and his answers in full. Lord Bully Brain was never allowed to set foot inside the Palace of Ice. King Gelidus, backed by the opinion of his favourites, still indulged the belief that he would be able in the end to refrigerate him. True, he had been many years at the task, so that it had now become a sort of hobby of his, and almost daily did his frigid Majesty pay a visit to his hot-headed subject and test his temperature by pressing a small ball of ice against his temples. To King Gelidus' mind, a man of so high a temperature was a continual menace to the peace and quiet of his kingdom. Vivat if Lord Hothead in a dream should wander forth some night and fall asleep with his back against one of the walls of the ice palace. Might he not melt away enough of it to throw the whole glorious fabric into a slump and slush of debris? It was terrible to think of, when he did think of it, and he thought of it quite often. But Bully Brain had no terrors for me, nor for Bulger either. In fact, Bulger was delighted to be stroked by a warm hand, and he and Bully Brain and I soon became the very best of friends, but his frigid Majesty was so alarmed when he heard of this friendship, that he was seized with quite a spasm of warmth, for, thought he, the united heat of 3 hotheads might work some terrible harm to the welfare of his people. So he issued the coldest kind of a decree carved on a tablet of ice, that Bully Brain and I should on no one day pass more than a half hour together, that we should never touch palm to palm, sleep in the same room, eat from the same dish, or sit on the same divan. These regulations were annoying, but I followed them to the letter, and when King Gelidus saw how careful I was to yield the strictest obedience to his decree, he conceived a genuine affection for me and sent several magnificent pelts to the ice house, which had been assigned to Bulger and me, for, of course, it would not have been safe for us to lodge in the palace itself, but his frigid Majesty held out the flattering prospect that the very moment Bulger and I should become properly refrigerated, apartments in the palace would be assigned to us, and, in fact, that I should be permitted to eat at the royal table. Are the coltiquerps? W7 Here did these strange folk come from? How did they ever find their way down into this world of eternal frost? And, above all, where do they get their food and clothing from? These were a few of the questions which I was so impatient to have answered that my temperature was raised a whole degree, and I was obliged to sleep with only one single pelt between me and my divan of crystal ice. For a man bred and born in so cold a country as the land of the Koltykwerps, Bully Brain had an extremely quick and active mind. On account of his rapid heartbeat, and the consequent high temperature of his body, he was not able to do his writing on slabs of ice as other learned Koltykwerps had done, for it would not have been a pleasant thing for him to see a poem which he had just finished literally melt away in his hands, without so much as leaving an ink stain behind, so he had been obliged, with King Gelidus' permission, to do his writing on thin tablets of alabaster. Before he began to talk to me about the progenitors of the Koltykwerps, he showed me a map of the country in the upper world once inhabited by them, and traced for me the course they had sailed upon abandoning that country, and described the beautiful shores they had landed upon in their search for a new home. I saw at a glance that it was Greenland which Bully Brain was thus unconsciously describing, and knowing as I did that in past ages Greenland had been a land of blue skies, warm winds, green meadows, and fertile valleys, before moving mountains of ice came down from the north and crushed all life out of it, I listened with breathless interest to his wonderful tales of its beautiful lakes, nestled at the foot of vine-clad mountains, all of which Bully Brain now looked upon in fair visions inherited from his ancestors. And I also knew that it must have been the Arctic Ocean which had been traversed by the ships of the Koltykwerps, who had then landed upon the, in those days, sunny shores of northern Russia. But the mountains of ice could sail too, and they followed the fleeing Koltykwerps like mighty monsters, dashing themselves with terrible roar and crash upon the peaceful shores, which they soon transformed into a wilderness of berg, of glacier, and of floe. Only a handful of the Koltykwerps survived, and these, in their dumb despair taking refuge in the clefts and caverns of the North Urals, could from their hiding places look upon one of the strangest sights that had ever greeted human eyes. So rapid had been the advance of these mighty masses of ice, crashing against the mountain sides and rending the very rocks in their fury, that the air gave up its warmth, and the sun was powerless to give it back again. The animals of the wildwood and the beasts of the field, overtaken in their flight, perished as they ran and stood there stark and stiff, with heads uptossed and muscles knotted. Them by the thousands and 10 times thousands the crushed crystals of the pursuing floods caught up like moss and leaves in a mountain torrent and packed in every cave and cavern on the way, tearing broader and loftier portals into these subterranean chambers, so that they might do their work the better. And these, then, O Bully Brain, are your meat quarries, I exclaimed, whence ye draw your daily food. Even so, little Baron, replied the hot-headed Koltykwerp, and not only our food, but the skins which serve us so admirably for clothing in this cold, underground world, and the oil, too, which burns in our beautiful alabaster lamps, besides 100 other things, such as bone for helves and handles, horn for needles and buttons and eating utensils, wool for the weaving of our undergarments, and magnificent pelts of bear and seal and walrus, which, laid upon our benches and divans of crystal ice, transform them into beds and couches which even an inhabitant of thy world might envy. But, O Bully Brain, I cried out, have ye not almost exhausted these supplies? Will not death from starvation soon stare ye all in the face in these deep and icy caverns of the underworld, visited by the sun's light yet unwhelmed by it? Nay, little Baron, answered Bully Brain with a smile almost as warm as one of my own, let not that thought give thee a moment's alarm, for we have as yet barely raised the lid of this ice-box of nature's packing. We are not large eaters anyway, continued Lord Hothead, for while it is true that we are not indolent people, for His frigid Majesty's palace and our dwellings need constant repair, and new hatchets and axes must be chipped out in the flint quarries and new lamps heaved and new garments woven, yet it is also true that we take life rather easy. We have no enemies to slay, no quarrels to settle, no gold to fight over, no land to drive our fellow creatures from and fence in, nor can we be ill, if we were willing to be, for in this pure, cold, crisp air disease would try in vain to sow her poison germs, Hence, needing no doctors, we have none, as we have no lawyers either, or merchants to sell us what belongs to us already. His frigid Majesty is an excellent king. I never read of a better one. I doubt that his like exists in the upper world. Always cool-headed, no thought of conquest, no dreams of power, no longings for empty pomp and show ever enter his mind. Since the day his father died and we set the great Koltykwerp crown of crystal ice upon his cool brow, his temperature has never risen but 1/2 degree, and that was only for a brief hour or so, and was occasioned by a mad proposal of one of his councillors, who claimed that he had discovered an explosive compound, something like the gunpowder of our world, I fancy, by which he could shatter the glorious window of rock crystal set in the mountain dome of our underworld and let in the warm sunshine. Did His Frigid Majesty Gelidus put this daring Koltykwerp to death? I asked. Oh, dear, no, replied Bully Brain. He merely ordered him to be refrigerated for so many hours a day until all his feverish projects had been chilled to death, for no doubt, little Baron, a man of thy deep learning knows full well that all the ills which thy world suffers from are the children of fevered brains, of minds made restless and visionary by the high temperature of the blood which gallops through the approaches to the dome of thought, stirring up wild dreams and visions as thy sun lifts the poisonous vapour from the stagnant pool. The more I listened to Bully Brain, the more I liked him. The fact of the matter is, I preferred to sit in his narrow cell with its plain walls of ice lighted up by a single alabaster lamp and converse with him to loitering in the splendid throne room of His Frigid Majesty King Gelidus. But Bulger had discovered that the pelts of Princess Schneeball's divan were much thicker, softer, and warmer than the single one allowed Lord Hothead, and therefore he preferred spending his time with her, but fearing lest he might get into mischief, I didn't dare to leave him alone with the princess too long at a time. Chapter 24. Some few things concerning the dear little Princess Schneeball. How she and one became fast friends, and how one day she conducted Bulger and me into her favourite grotto to see the LRRLE man with the frozen smile. Something about him. What came of my having looked upon him quite fully described. At the time of Bulger's and my arrival in the land of the Koltykwerps, the Princess Schneeball was about 15 years of age, and I must say that rarely had it been my good fortune to make the acquaintance of such a sweet-tempered, lovable little creature. She flitted about the ice palace like a beam of sunlight, and there was nothing of the spoiled child about her, although a bit mischievous at times. Her voice was as full of music as a skylark's, and it was not many days before she and I had become the best friends in the world. Now, you must know, dear friends, that according to the law of the Koltykwerps, a princess is left absolutely free to choose her own husband, and His Frigid Majesty was very anxious that Schneeball should pick hers out as soon as possible. Moreover, the law of the land gave her perfect freedom to choose a husband of high or low degree, provided he was young enough. The way in which a Koltykwerp princess was required to make known her preference was to press a kiss upon the cheek of the young man whom she might settle upon. This ennobled him at once, and he became the heir apparent to the throne of ice, and entitled to sit on its steps until he should be crowned king. Now, His Frigid Majesty was delighted to see this friendship spring up between Schneeball and me, for he hoped to make use of my influence to bring her to set the necessary kiss on some youth's cheek before I took my departure from the cold kingdom of the Koltykwerps. I gave him the word of a nobleman that I would do my best to carry out his wishes. With Schneeball for a guide, Bulger and I often went for walks through the splendid ice grottos of her father's kingdom, selecting days when the sunlight of the outer world poured strongest through the mighty lens set in the side of the mountain. Then these grottos took on a splendour that my poor tongue is powerless to describe. Their crystal mazes glittered as if their walls were set with massive jewels most wonderfully cut and polished, and as if their ceilings were fretted with gems so peerless that all the gold of the upper world would fall far short of paying for them. Here, there, and everywhere the skill of the Koltykwerps had carved and chiselled graceful flights of steps, broad landings with majestic columns, and winding corridors lined with long rows of statues, single and group-wise, and ever and anon the visitor came upon a terrace where, seated upon a fur-covered divan, he might look out upon the bewildering beauty of King Gelidus' icy domains, arch touching arch and dome springing from dome, while over and above all, through the gigantic lens in its granite setting, a mile above our heads, streamed a flood of glorious sunlight, lighting up this world within a world with a radiance so grand and so complete as to seem to be a sun of a far greater splendor than the one that warmed the upper world and bathed it in so many gorgeous hues at morn and eve. Hardly a day went by now that the princess of the Koltykwerps did not surprise either Bulger or me with some gift or other. To tell the truth, dear friends, although my Russian coat was fur-trimmed, yet I began to feel the need of warmer garments after a week's sojourn in the icy domain of King Gelidus, and I think Schneeball must have heard my teeth chattering, for one morning, upon entering the Palace of Ice, I was delighted to be presented with a full suit of fur precisely similar to the one worn by King Gelidus himself. Nor was Bulger forgotten by the loving little princess, for with her own hands she had knitted him a blanket of the softest wool, which she belted so snugly around his body and tied so tightly around his neck that henceforth he felt perfectly comfortable in the chill air of the home of the Koltykwerps. One day the Princess Schneeball said to me, "Oh, come, little Baron, come to my favorite grotto, now that the sun's rays are bright within it, there shalt thou see a wonder." "A wonder, Princess Schneeball?" "Yes, little Baron, a wonder," she repeated, "the little man with the frozen smile." "Little man with the frozen smile?" I echoed. come and see, little Baron," cried Schneeball, hurrying on ahead. In a few moments we had reached the grotto and bounded into it with the princess leading the way. Suddenly she halted in front of a magnificent block of crystal ice, clear as polished glass, and cried out, "There, look! There is the little man with the frozen smile." Even now, as the thought of that moment comes over me, I feel something of the thrill of half fear, half joy, as my eyes fell upon the little creature shut in that superb block of ice, himself a part of it, himself its heart, its contents, its mystery. Here, in its center, in easy posture, with wide-opened eyes, and with what might be called a smile upon its face, that is a glint of kindliness and affection in its strange eyes with their overhanging brows, sat a small animal of the chimpanzee race. He had possibly been asleep when the icy flood struck him, dreaming of beautiful trees bending beneath purple fruit, of cloudless skies above and a coral beach below, and death had come to him so quickly that he had become a brother to this block of ice while the happy dream was still in his thoughts. The LRRLE man with the frozen smile. It was wonderful, it was more than wonderful. Spellbound by the strange spectacle, I stood there, I know not how long, with my eyes looking into his. At last Schneeball's voice aroused me. "Ha! Ha!" she laughed. "Look, little Baron, Bulger is trying to kiss his poor dead brother." In truth, Bulger did have his nose pressed firmly against the block of ice in his effort to scent the strange animal imprisoned in that crystal cell, so near, and yet so far beyond the reach of his keen scent. "Well, little Baron," cried Schneeball, "did I not speak truly? Have I not shown thee the little man with the frozen smile?" "Indeed thou'st, fair princess," was my reply, "and I cannot tell thee how grateful I am to thee for having done so." Then, as she plucked me by the sleeve, I pleaded, "Nay, gentle Schneeball, not yet, let me bide a bit longer. The little man with the frozen smile seems to beg me not to go. I can almost imagine that I hear him whisper, 'Oh little Baron, break open the crystal cell of my prison and take me with thee back to the world of sunshine, back to the land of the orange tree, where the soft warm winds used to rock me to sleep in the cradle of the swaying boughs, while the wise and watchful patriarch of our flock stood guard over us all.'" Schneeball's big, round, grey eyes filled with tears at these words. "Would that he were alive, little Baron," she murmured, "and that I could give him some of my happiness to pay him back for all the long years he has been spending in his icy prison." In a few moments Schneeball took me by the hand and led me away from the great block of ice with its silent prisoner. My heart was very heavy, and both Schneeball and Bulger did their utmost to divert me, but all to no purpose. Leaving the princess at the portal of the palace, I went to my dwelling, which was ablaze with the soft glow of its alabaster lamps, and there I found a beautiful new pelt spread over my divan, a new gift from King Gelidus. But I could take no pleasure in it. My thoughts were all with the little man with the frozen smile locked in the icy embrace of that crystal mould, which, in its cold irony, let him seem to be so free and unfettered and yet held him in such vice-like grip. After a while I dismissed my serving people and laid me down for the night with my dear Bulger nestled against my breast. But I could not sleep. All night long those strange eyes with their uncanny glint followed me about, pleading strong but silent for me to come again, for me to soften my heart like a child of the sunshine that I was, to shatter his crystal dungeon, and set him loose, to bear him away from the icy domain of the Coltiquerps out into the warm air of the upper world. What was I dreaming about? Was he not dead? Had not his spirit left his body thousands and thousands of years ago? Why should I let such wild thoughts vex my mind? What good would come of it? None whatever. I was a reasonable creature, I must not give logment within my brain to such silly ideas. The little man with the frozen smile had been, through almost playful fate, laid away in a beautiful tomb. I must not disturb it. No doubt in his lifetime he had been the pet of a noble manor, brought to the Northland from some sunny clime by master of powerful argosy. Let him rest in peace. I must not dare to mar the beauty of his crystal tomb, so gloriously transparent. I was even sorry that Schneeball had led me into her beautiful grotto, and resolved to go thither no more. What poor weak creatures are we, so fertile in good resolutions and yet so unfruitful of results, planting whole acres with fair promises, but when the tender shoots pierce the ground turning our back upon the crop as if it didn't belong to us. Chapter 25. A sleepless night for Bulger and me, and what followed interview with King Gelidus. My request and his reply. What all took place when one learned that the king and his councillors had decided not to grant my request. Strange tumult among the Coltiquerps, and how his frigid majesty stilled it, and some other things. Not only had I been unable to sleep, but by my tossing about I had kept poor dear Bulger awake so that when morning came we both looked haggard enough. I felt as if I had been through a fit of sickness, and no doubt he did too. At any rate I had no appetite for the heavy meat diet of the Coltiquerps, and seeing me refuse my breakfast, Bulger did likewise. I had promised Schneeball to come early to the palace, for she had a number of questions which she wished to ask me concerning the upper world. "Good morning, little Baron," she cried in her sweetest tones as I entered the throne room. "Didst sleep well last night on the new pelt which Papa sent thee?" I was about to make a reply when Schneeball's hand coming in contact with we had both removed our gloves in order to shake uttered a piercing scream, and drawing back stood there blowing her breath on her right palm as she exclaimed, again and again, "Firebrand! Firebrand!" In an instant King Gelidus and a group of his councillors drew near, and, pulling over their gloves, one after the other laid his hand in mine. "Glowing coals!" cried his frigid majesty. "Tongue aflame!" roared Frostifizz. "Boiling water!" groaned Glacierbhoy. "Red hot!" hissed Icicle. "Thou must leave the palace at once," half pleaded King Gelidus. It would simply be madness for me to permit such a firebrand to remain within the walls of the royal residence. The intense heat of thy body would be sure to melt a hole in its walls ere the sun goes down. The royal councillors again drew off their gloves and laid hands upon poor Bulger, when a second alarm, even wilder than the first, was sent up and we were hastily escorted back to our lodging house. No doubt, dear friends, you will be somewhat mystified upon reading these words, but the explanation is easy. Owing to worriment and lack of sleep, Bulger and I had awaked in a highly feverish condition, and to the Coltiquerps we had really seemed to be almost on fire, but our fever left us toward night, hearing which, King Gelidus sent for us and did all in his power to entertain us with song and dance, in both of which, Schneeball was very skilled. Finding that his frigid majesty was in such a rosy humour, if I may be allowed to speak that way of a person whose face was almost as white as the alabaster lamps over his head, I determined to ask him for permission to cleave asunder the icy cell of the little man with the frozen smile, and ascertain if possible from the collar, which, made up apparently of gold and silver coin, was clasped around his neck, to whom he had belonged and where his home had been. No sooner had I preferred my request, than I noticed that the white face of the royal Gelidus parted with its smile and took on a terribly icy look. Methought I could look through the tip of his nose as though an icicle, and methought, too, that his ears shone in the light of the alabaster lamps like sheets of crystal ice, and that his voice as he spoke puffed into my face like the first flakes of a coming snowstorm. I quickly repented me of my rash action. But it was too late, and I determined to stand by it. Little Baron, spoke royal Gelidus in icy tones, never a heart beat in a kingly breast that was purer and colder than mine, freer from the warmth of selfishness, with not a single hot corner for ire or anger to nestle in, or for weakness or folly to make their hiding places. For thousands of years my people have inhabited this icy domain and breathed this pure cold air, and never yet hath one desired to strike an axe of flint into the walls of that crystal prison. However, little Baron, there may be some warm corner in my heart wherein cold and limpid wisdom may not be at home. Therefore, come to me tomorrow for my answer, meanwhile I'll take counsel with the coolest brains and coldest hearts about me. If they see no harm in thy request, thou mayst crack open the crystal gates that have for so many centuries shut the man-like creature in his silent cell, and take him forth in order to study the mystic words graven on his collar, but upon the strict condition that in cleaving open his house of crystal my quarrymen so apply their wedges of flint as to break the block into 2 equal pieces, that when thou'st read what may be there, the 2 parts be closed upon the little man again, edge fitting edge, like a perfect mould, so exactly that to the eye no sign of line or joint be visible. Dost promise, little Baron, that this shall be as to our royal will? It seems meet that it should be. I promised most solemnly that the crystal cell of the little man with the frozen smile should be opened and closed exactly as his frigid majesty had directed. It would be hard for me to tell you, dear friends, how happy I went to rest that night upon my icy divan, and how as the tiny flame of my alabaster lamp shed its soft glow upon the walls of ice, I lay there turning over in my mind the strange and mysterious pleasure which was soon to fall to my lot when the quarrymen of King Gelidus should set their wedges of flint in this glorious block of ice and cleave it asunder. Even Don Fum, master of masters, had never dreamed of receiving a message from the people who lived in the very childhood of the world, and in anticipation already I enjoyed the splendid triumph which would be mine when I came to lecture before learned societies upon the mysterious lettering on the curious collar clasping the neck of the little man with the frozen smile. Imagine my anguish then, dear friends, upon receiving a message from King Gelidus the next day that his councillors had with one voice decreed against the opening of the crystal prison which stood in Schneeball's grotto. I was as if smitten with some sudden and awful ailment. I had never felt until that moment how keen the tooth of disappointment could be. I shivered first with a chill that made me brother to the Coltic Worps, and then I burned with a fever so raging that a wild rumour spread through Gelidus' icy domain that I was setting fire to the very walls and roof. With wild outcries, and faces drawn with nameless dread, the subjects of his frigid majesty rushed pell-mell up the wide flights of stairs leading to the palace of ice, and pleaded for the king to show himself. In cold and frigid majesty, Gelidus walked out upon the platform and listened to the prayers of his people. "We shall burn," they cried, "our beautiful homes will fall about our ears. Ice crystal steps will melt away, and all these fair columns and arches and statues and pedestals will turn to water and empty themselves into the lower caverns of the earth. The great window of our sky will fall with awful crash upon our heads, putting an end forever to this fair domain of crystal splendor. O Gelidus, haste thee, ere it be too late, let the little baron have his way before bitter disappointment transforms his body and limbs into tongues of flame to lick up this magnificent palace in a single night, and dash its 1,000 alabaster lamps to the ground, a heap of sherds, no fragment matching its brother fragment, but all a wretched mass of worthless matter. King Gelidus and his frosty counsellors saw that it would be useless to attempt to reason with the people, and therefore turning toward them, he coldly waved his chilly right hand, and with an icy smile spoke frostily as follows: "Go, Coltiquerps, to your homes, and be happy. Why, think you, have I a heated brain, doth my heart steam with foolishness, that you should think me capable of wishing harm to the tiniest Coltiquerp that spins his top of ice in my fair kingdom? Go to your homes, I say, the little baron is already cooling off, for he hath my full consent to cleave asunder the crystal prison of the little man with the frozen smile. There is nothing be frightened about, my children. So eat hearty suppers and sleep soundly tonight, for my royal word for it, by tomorrow morning the little baron will cease to be the least bit dangerous to the peace and welfare of our icy kingdom. A cold good night to you all." In a short half-hour the panic-stricken Coltiquerps were all back in their homes again, and when a messenger came from King Gelidus to measure my temperature he found such a great improvement that he opened his chilly heart and sent me a beautiful present from his treasure house, to wit, a small block of ice, clearer than any gem I had ever seen, in the heart of which lay a glorious red rose in fullest bloom, each velvet petal opened out eagerly. Upon consulting my diary I found that it was just 6 months to a day since I had left Castle Trump and the loved ones sheltered by its time-worn tiles, and cold as was the covering of this thrice beautiful child of the upper world I clasped it to my breast and shed tears. And this was the way it came about, dear friends, that King Gelidus and his frosty counsellors were brought to give their consent to my cleaving asunder the icy prison wherein lay the little man with the frozen smile. Chapter 26. How the quarrymen of King Gelidus cleft asunder the crystal prison of the little man with the frozen smile. My bitter disappointment, and how one bore it. Wonderful happenings of the night that followed. Bulger again proves himself to be an animal of extraordinary sagacity. Bulger and I had little appetite for the dainty breakfast of stewed sweetbreads which the Coltiquerps set before us the next morning, for I knew, and he half suspected, that something important was going to happen, being nothing less than the cleaving asunder of the crystal cell which had held the little chimpanzee a prisoner for so many centuries. Walking beside the merry Princess Schneebaul, who was delighted to know that His Frigid Majesty, her father, had at last yielded to my wishes, Bulger and I set out for the beautiful ice grotto. Behind us walked Frostifiz and Glaciobhoy with instructions from the king to supervise the cleaving asunder of the block of ice, and after them came 4 of King Gelidus' quarrymen, 2 bearing flint axes with helves of polished bone, and 2 carrying the flint wedges to be used in the work. We soon entered Schneebaul's grotto, and the task was at once entered upon. It seemed to me I could almost see the little man with the frozen smile wink his eyelids as the quarrymen set their wedges in place and began to mark the line of fracture, but, of course, dear friends, you know what an imagination I have, especially when I get worked up over anything. So you must take what I say sometimes with a grain of salt, although as a rule, you may accept my statements with childlike confidence. With such wonderful skill did the Coltiquerpian quarrymen use their axes and wedges that in a few moments, to my great delight, the huge block of ice fell asunder in perfect halves, in one of which the little man-like creature lay on his side like a casting in a mould. I made haste to lift him out and ap him a soft pelt, which I had brought along for that purpose, and then I turned to retrace my steps to my chamber, where I intended to begin at once my study of whatever inscriptions should be found upon his curious collar. "Remember, little baron," said Glaciobhoy, "by express command of His Frigid Majesty, the little man with the frozen smile must be returned to his crystal cell tomorrow morning at this very hour." I bowed assent, and then, having accompanied Princess Schneebaul as far as the bottom of the grand staircase leading to the ice palace, I turned away and was soon in the privacy of my own apartment. Now came for me one of the bitterest disappointments of my life, but I submitted with a good grace, for it was fit punishment visited upon me for my foolish vanity in striving to unearth some older record of the human race than had yet been done by any of the great searchers and philosophers, not even excepting that master of masters, Don Strephalophigeguinarius Fum. Know then, dear friends, that the quaint collar, made up of gold and silver coins, or discs, cunningly linked together, which encircled the animal's neck, contained not a single word or letter of any language, the undersides being quite blank, and the upper merely having roughly carved outlines of an object which might possibly have been intended for the sun. Wrapping the animal up in the soft pelt, I laid him away in a corner of my divan and betook myself to the palace of his frigid majesty, where I frankly informed King Gelidus of my great disappointment in not finding some few words or even a single word of a language unknown to the wisest heads of the upper world. Schneeball was so touched by my sadness that, had I not skilfully kept out of her way, I verily believe she would have thrown her arms around my neck and imprinted upon my cheek the kiss which would have made me the king of the Coltiquerps, but I had no longing to spend the rest of my life in the icy domains of his frigid majesty, even though my brow would be crowned with the cold crown of the Coltiquerps. If I had been an old man, with slow and feeble pulse, it would have been very different, but my heart was too warm and my blood too hot to fill such a position with agreeableness to myself or satisfaction to the people of this icy underworld. So I kept the little princess busy enough, I can assure you, first with songs, then with dance, and then with story-telling. That night King Gelidus ordered a magnificent fete to be held in my honor. 500 more alabaster lamps were lighted, and the royal divans were laid with the richest pelts in the palace, and after the dancing and singing had ended, frozen tidbits from the royal kitchen were passed around on alabaster salvers, and Bulger and I ate until our teeth ached. It was late when we reached our own apartment, and so full were my thoughts of the beautiful sights which we had gazed upon in the throne room, that I had quite forgotten about the poor little man with the frozen smile whom I had covered up and tucked away on my divan, but Bulger had not been so hard-hearted. 20 times during the evening he had given me a sly tug at my sleeve as much as to say, "Bulger shows the Baron something wonderful. Come, little master, let's hurry back. Dost not remember that we left my poor little frozen brother tucked away in that icy chamber all alone by himself?" I was very weary and I fell off to sleep almost immediately, and yet I had an indistinct recollection that Bulger was not in his place against my breast. I remembered feeling for him, but that's all. It never flashed upon me that he had gone and lain down beside the poor little stranger, whom I had so unfeelingly lifted from his last resting place, and yet such must have been the case, for about midnight, it seemed to me, I was awakened by a gentle tugging at my sleeve. It was my faithful Bulger, but, half awake and half asleep as I was, I merely thought that he was only asking for a caress, as was often his wont when he fell a-thinking about home, so I reached out and stroked his head several times and dropped off again. But the tugging began anew, and this time 'twas more vigorous, and with it came an impatient whine which meant, "Come, come, little master, rouse thee, dost suppose I would break thy rest unless there were good reasons for it?" I didn't need a third reminder, but with a single bound landed on my feet, and reaching out for one of the tiny tapers which the Coltiquerps make use of as lighters, I carried the flames from the single lamp burning on the wall to the 3 others hanging here and there. The icy walls of my chamber were now ablaze with light. There sat Bulger on the fur-covered divan, beside the place where the little man with the frozen smile lay hidden under the pelt. His tail was wagging nervously, and his large, lustrous eyes were fixed first upon me and then upon the covering of his dead brother with an expression I never remembered having seen in them before, and then with a sudden movement he laid hold of the pelt and, drawing it aside, showed me, what think you, dear friends, what, I ask in a tone half whisper, half gasp, for now years after I still can feel that wonderful thrill which I felt then. VVHY, it was alive. That ape-like creature had come to life after his sleep of thousands of years in that narrow, crystal cell. Bulger had lain down beside his frozen brother and warmed him back to life again. Oh, it was wondrously wonderful to see that pair of little eyes, bead-like in brightness, look up and blink at me, and then to hear that low, moaning voice, so human-like, as if it whimpered, with a shake and a shiver, "Oh, how cold it is! How very cold it is! There's the sun! There's the soft warm wind, and where are the cloudless skies so blue, oh so beautifully blue, that used to hang over my head?" Bidding Bulger lie down again beside him and snuggle up as close as possible, I made haste to cover them both with the softest skins I could find. In a few moments there came from underneath the pile a low, contented cry of "Cooja! Cooja! Cooja!" followed by a curious addition sounding like "Fuff! Fuff! Fuff!" So I put them all together and named the strange newcomer to the icy domain of King Gelidus, Fuff Cooja. Sleep any more that night? Not a wink. The same joy came over me that I used to feel on Christmas morning long ago when Kris Kringle brought me some wonderful bit of mechanism moved by a secret spring, for I always scorned to accept ordinary toys like ordinary children, and oh, how I longed for the morning, when it would be time for me to bundle up the little man, no longer him with the frozen smile, but Fuff Cooja, the live boy from far away, with his curious little face screwed up into such a funny look, and carry him to the palace. How delighted Schneeball will be, thought I, and King Gelidus too, how he will unbend from his frigid majesty as he watches the antics of Fuff Cooja, and how pleased all the dignified Koltykwerpians, including even Frostifizz and Glacierbhoy, will be when I tell them that the little man with the frozen smile has come to life again. What crowds of Koltykwerps, men, women and children, will rush up the long flights of steps leading to the Ice Palace, begging and entreating King Gelidus to let them have just a little look at Fuff Cooja, the little man set free from his icy cell by the famous traveller, Baron Sebastian von Trump, Chapter 27. Excitement over Fuff Cooja. I carry him to the court of King Gelidus. His instant affection for Princess Schneeball. I am accused of exercising the black art. My defense and my reward. Anxiety of the Koltykwerps lest Fuff Cooja perish of hunger. This calamity averted, another stares us in the face, how to keep him from freezing to death. I solve the problem, but draw upon me a strange misfortune. It all turned out just as I had thought it would. The moment it became known that the little man with the frozen smile had actually come to life, the wildest excitement prevailed in every part of the icy domain of his frigid majesty. I was astounded at the change in the actions of the Koltykwerps. They moved more quickly, they talked faster, they made more gestures than I had ever seen them do before. In some cases, you will hardly believe it, dear friends, I actually noticed a faint glow in the cold cheeks of a few of them. I had hoped to be able to bundle Fuff Cooja up warmly and make my escape to the Ice Palace before the people learned of his coming to life, but in vain. Even I made my appearance at the door, there was a large crowd of Koltykwerps pushing and pulling in front of my quarters. Most of them were good-natured, and cried out, "Show him to us, little Baron, show us the little man with the frozen smile whom thou hast brought to life. Let us look upon his face." "Nay, nay, Koltykwerps," I exclaimed, "it must not be. His frigid majesty must be the first to look upon Fuff Cooja's face. Room for the noble guest of royal Gelidus. In the name of his frigid majesty give way and let me pass." The Koltykwerps showed no inclination to obey. To such a pitch of excitement had they worked themselves up that only upon seeing Bulger advance upon them with flashing eye and teeth laid bare, did they reach the conclusion that my brave companion was in no mood to be trifled with. Thwarted in their wild desire to get a peep at Fuff Cooja, the Koltykwerps now began to rail at me as I passed them by on my way to the Ice Palace. "Aho, Master Magician! Ha, ha, Prince of the Black Art! Boo, boo, little wizard! Have a care, wily necromancer, see to it that thou dost not practice any of thy tricks of enchantment upon us." I was glad when the axe-bearer saw my plight and hurried forward to extricate me from the crowd of angry people. King Gelidus met me at the portal of his ice palace, and at his heels came Princess Schneebaul, who could hardly wait for her turn to take a look at the curious living creature which I unwrapped just enough to let her see its nose. The instant Fufkuja set eyes upon the sweet face of the Koltikwerpian princess, he stretched out his little arm as a child might to its mother. This sudden show of affection caused Schneebaul the liveliest pleasure, and quickly drawing off one of her gloves she reached out and stroked the animal's head, but at the touch of those, to him, icy little fingers he uttered a low wail and drew back underneath the warm pelt in which he was snugly wrapped. Poor Schneebaul! She gave a sigh as she saw him do this, but it didn't prevent her from coming every minute or so and lifting one end of the pelt just enough to take another look at Fufkuja, who, while he never failed to cuddle up closer to me at sight of the princess, yet invariably thrust out one of his black paws from under the pelt for Schneebaul to shake. While seated on the divan nearest the throne, I observed that Frostifiz and Glaciobhoy were holding a whispered conference with His Frigid Majesty. At once I guessed the subject of their conversation. Rising to my feet, I made a sign that I wished to address the king, and when he had nodded his head with stern and icy dignity, I began to speak. You know, dear friends, how eloquent I can be when the mood is upon me. Well, standing there almost upon the steps of King Gelidus' throne of ice, I proceeded to defend myself against the charge of being a master of the black art. I will not tell you all I said, but this was my ending: may it please your frigid majesty. Here beside me stands the only magician in the case, and the only art, the only trick or charm which was exercised by him was that sweet power we call love. When first he set eyes upon his four-footed brother locked in the crystal cell of Schneebaul's grotto, he pressed his nose again and again against its icy wall in vain attempt to know his kinsman, and turned away with a cry of sorrow to find that his keen scent could not penetrate to him. I cannot tell you how great was his joy when I laid Fufkuja stiff and stark upon my divan, for I knew not then the scheme ripening in Bulger's mind. But later, all was plain enough. The loving dog leaves his master's breast and carries his true and tender heart over to where Fufkuja lies, raises the pelt, crawls in beside him, and presses his warm breast firm and hard against his brother's ice-locked heart, and warms him into life again, then wakes me and tells me what he hath done. This, royal Gelidus and most noble Koltikwerps, is the only art that hath been used to bring Fufkuja back to life again, and to call it black is to slander the sunshine, rail at the lily, and call the sweet breath of heaven a vile and detestable thing. When I had ended my speech I saw that Schneebaul had been weeping, and that several of her tears stopped in their course her cheeks hung there sparkling like tiny diamonds in the soft light of the alabaster lamps, where the chill air of Gelidus' palace had turned them into ice. And therefore when His Frigid Majesty said that my words had touched his heart, and bade me ask for a gift from his hand, I said, O cold king of this fair icy domain, let those tears that now hang like tiny jewels on Schneebaul's cheeks be brushed into an alabaster box and given to me. I covet no other guerdon. Even if I did not love thee, little baron, cried King Gelidus with an icy smile, I would be persuaded, but loving makes easy believing. Go, Frostifiz, and bid one of the princess's women brush those tiny jewels that hang on Schneebaul's cheek into an alabaster cup and bestow them upon the little baron. Scarcely had this been done when Fufkuja thrust his head out from under the pelt and, fixing his eyes pleadingly upon me, thrust out his tongue and opened and shut his mouth with a faint, smacking noise. Quick as a flash it dawned upon me that these signs meant that Fufkuja was hungry. And then, as I suddenly remembered that the Koltikwerps were strictly a meat-eating people, that only meat was to be had in their chill domain, quarried almost like marble itself from nature's great refrigerators, a gasp escaped my lips, and I whispered, "Oh, he must die. He must die." My words had not missed the keen ears of Princess Schneebaul. "Speak, little baron," she cried, why must little Fufkuja die? What dost mean by such a saying?" And when King Gelidus and Schneebaul had heard me voice my fear that he would die rather than feed on meat, they both became very heavy-hearted. Poor little Fufkuja, moaned the princess, can it be possible that he must be carried back so soon to his crystal cell in my grotto? Bid the master of my meat quarries approach the throne, cried King Gelidus suddenly, in a voice of icy dignity. This important functionary soon made his appearance. Turning to me, the king bade me explain the case to him. His I did in a few words, when, to the great joy of all present, the master of the meat quarries spoke as follows: Little Baron, if that's the only trouble, give thyself no further uneasiness, for I shall at once send one of my men to thee with a supply of most delicious nuts. Delicious nuts? I repeated in a tone of amazement. Why, yes, little Baron, I have a goodly supply on hand. Know, then, that hardly a day goes by that my men don't come upon some fine specimen of the family of Noras, most generally squirrels, in whose cheek pouches we invariably find from 1 to half a dozen dainty nuts stowed away. It has always been my custom to lay these aside, and so I have to inform thee that if Fufkuja should live to be 100 years old, I or my successor could guarantee to keep him supplied with food. These words lifted a terrible load off my heart, for now, at least, Fufkuja would not die of starvation. For a few days everything went well. The Koltykwerps became quite satisfied in their own minds that I had not been practicing the black art in the chilly kingdom of His Frigid Majesty, and each and every one of them became greatly attached to the curious little creature with the droll little face and droller manner. But it seemed as if we were no sooner out of one trouble than we were plumped into another, for now Fufkuja began to object to the attendant selected to look after him by King Gelidus. The man was about 10 degrees too cold-blooded for him, and ere long it was only necessary for the Koltykwerp to approach Fuf, as we called him for short, in order to throw him into convulsions of shivering and to cause him to utter pitiable cries of discontent, which only ceased upon my appearing and comforting him by my caresses. I now set to work to devise some way to make Fuf's life more agreeable to him, for everybody seemed to hold me responsible for his well-being. 10 times a day came messengers from King Gelidus or from Princess Schneeball to ask how he was getting on, and whether we were keeping him warm enough, whether he had all he wanted to eat, whether he had pelts enough on his bed. Nor was it an unusual thing to have a score or more Koltykwerpian mothers call at my quarters during a single day with advice enough to last a month, and therefore was it that, with a view to providing him with a warmer room to sleep in, I ordered a divan fitted up for him in a smaller chamber opening into mine, upon the walls of which I directed half a dozen of the largest lamps to be hung. The consequence was that the walls began to melt, hearing of which, consternation spread throughout the icy domain of His Frigid Majesty, for to the mind of a Koltykwerp heat powerful enough to melt ice was something terrible. It was like the dread of earthquake shock to us, or the fear of flood or flame. It was something that filled their hearts with such terror that in their dreams they saw the solid walls of the ice palace melt asunder and fall with a crash. They could not bear it, and so King Gelidus put forth the decree that if there were no other way to keep Fufkuja alive, then must he die. Hearing this, an awful grief came upon poor Schneeball's heart, for she had learned to love little Fuf very dearly, and it set a knife in her breast to think of losing him. Never, never, she cried, shall I be able to set foot within my grotto if Fufkuja is put back into his crystal prison again, with his frozen smile on his face as once used to be. And seeking out her royal father, she threw herself at his knees and spoke as follows: O heart of ice! O frigid Majesty, let not thy child die of grief. There is an easy way out of all our trouble with dear little Fufkuja. Speak, beloved Schneeball, answered King Gelidus, let me hear what it is. Vvhy, cold heart, said the princess, the little baron hath plenty of warmth stored away in his body, he hath enough for both himself and Fufkuja into the bargain. Therefore, frigid father, command that a deep, warm hood be made to the little baron's coat, and that Fufkuja be placed therein and be borne about by the little baron wherever he goeth. He will soon grow accustomed to the slender burden and note it no more. It shall be as thou wishest, replied the king of the Koltykwerps, and calling his trusty counsellor, Glaciobhoy, he directed him to summon me at once to the throne room. When I heard this terrible order issue from the icy lips of King Gelidus, my heart sank within me, and yet I dared not disobey, I dared not murmur, for I it was who had cleft asunder the crystal prison of the little man with the frozen smile, I who had made it possible for Bulger to warm him back to life again. Oh, poor, vain, weak, foolish boy that I had been, what was to become of me now? Chapter 28. How old little burden may grow to be a grievous one. Story of a man with a monkey in his hood. My terrible suffering. Concerning the awful panic that seized upon the Koltykwerps. My visit to the deserted ice palace, and what happened to Fufkuja. End of his brief but strange career. A frozen KLSS on a blade of horn, or how Schneeball chose a husband. Ah, little princess, how easy was it for thee to say that I would soon grow accustomed to the slender burden and note it no more. How prone are we to call light the burdens which we lay upon the shoulders of others for our own benefit. True, Fufkuja was not as long as a horse, nor as broad as an ox, and when in accordance with the king's decree the hood had been completed and the little animal was stowed away therein, close against my back so as to get a goodly share of the warmth of my body, it seemed to me that Schneeball was right, that I would soon become accustomed to the load and note it no more. And so it seemed the second and the third day, but not on the fourth, for on that day the little load appeared to have gained somewhat in weight, and although I was quick to feign that it was not so when Princess Schneeball quizzed me saying, "There, little baron, did I not tell thee that thou wouldst soon forget that Fufkuja slept upon thy shoulders," yet in my heart I felt that he really had grown a mite heavier. On the fifth day Bulger and I were bidden to a merry-making at the Palace of Ice, and as I rose from my divan to betake me thither out I was strangely heavy-hearted, and so did Bulger, for he made several efforts to draw a smile, or a cheery tone, from me, but in vain. The Baron's flight to the Ice Palace. Suddenly I realized that there was a weight pressing against my back, no, not a heavy weight, but a weight all the same, and then I whispered to myself, "Why, if I am going to a merry-making, I'll cast it off," and then I wakened from my deep abstraction and murmured, "How strange that I should have forgotten that Fufkuja was in my hood." And so I went to the merry-making with Fufkuja nestled between my shoulders, and the Koltykwerps laughed at the little baron and his child, as they called him, and drew near and raised the flap and peeped in at the curious creature within the hood, and when Fufkuja felt their icy breaths, he buried his nose in the fur and sighed and whimpered. Then, for a moment, when the Princess Schneeball came and sat beside me and praised me for my readiness to carry out her wishes, and thanked me so sweetly for my goodness to her, I forgot all about the little load laid upon me, and I ate the frozen tidbits from the royal kitchen, and laughed and joked with Lords Frostifizz and Glacierbhoy, just as had been my wont before Gelidus had decreed that Fufkuja should make his bed on my shoulders. But when the feat was over and I stepped from the broad portal of the Ice Palace and looked up at the mighty lens set in the mountain side, through which the moonlight of the outer world was streaming in subdued but glorious splendor, I suddenly felt my legs bend under me, I staggered from right to left, I clutched at shadows, I was, it seemed to me, about to be crushed beneath a terrible burden. I quickened my pace, I broke into a run, I threw my arms into the air as if I would cast off the weight that was smothering me. And so I came to my lodging puffing, panting, gasping. "Why, what a fool am I," was my first word when I had got my breath, "it's only a little Fufkuja on my back, stowed away in my fur hood." I must be beside myself to have thought that a great monster was seated there and that he was gradually pressing me down, crushing the life out of me by degrees, flattening me to the very ground, and I not able to escape from his terrible embrace or to squirm out from under his awful limbs wrapped around my neck and body. All night long this monster was clinging to me, and urging me to a faster pace, up and down, across and around, I knew not where, on bootless errands, ending only to begin again, on searches after nothing hidden nowhere, trying 1,000 lids and finding every one locked, returning home only to go forth again, up and away and out on interminable highways vanishing in a point far on ahead, with that grievous burden forever on my shoulders growing heavier and heavier, till it seemed that I must go down with it into the dust. But no, it knew full well that it must not ride me to the death, so when I was ready to drop, it threw off part of its weight to give me courage to begin again. Even the morning came, my pulse was galloping and my cheeks were on fire. I could feel the blood pounding against my temples, and it was natural that my face should be crimsoned over with the flush of fever. Half in a daze I walked forth toward the grand staircase leading up to the ice palace, when suddenly I was startled by a fearful scream. I halted and looked up, when another and another burst upon my ears. The terrified Coltiquerps were fleeing before me in every direction, shrieking as they fled, "Fly, fly, brothers, the little baron is burning, the little baron is burning, fly, brothers, fly." In a few moments terror had seized upon every living creature in the icy domain of King Gelidus. They fled from me in mad haste, taking refuge in the distant caverns and corridors, filling the air with their wild outcries, no one being brave enough to halt and take a second look. My inflamed countenance filled them with such awful terror that they could only tear along and cry, "Fly, brothers, fly, the little baron is burning, the little baron is burning." With Bulger at my heels, I turned and sprang up the staircase with the intention of seeking out King Gelidus, and explaining the matter to him. But he, too, had fled, and with him every sentinel and serving man, every courtier and counsellor. The palace was as still as death. I hastened through its silent corridors yelling out, "Schneebaul! Princess Schneebaul! Surely thou art not afraid of me? Turn back, I will not harm thee, I am not burning. Turn back, oh, turn back." With this, I reached the throne room, not a living creature was to be seen, the vast chamber was as still as death. I staggered to a divan, and pillowing my poor aching head on a cushion, I fell into a sound and refreshing sleep. Then I awoke, I rubbed my eyes and looked about me, and at first I thought that I was still alone in the great round chamber with its walls of ice, but no, there on the divan sat Schneebaul, and she smiled and said in mock displeasure, "Thou art not a very watchful nurse, little baron, for in thy sleep thou didst squeeze Fufkuja so tightly against a cushion, that he crawled out from thy hood and nestled in my arms." "In thy arms, Schneebaul?" I exclaimed breathlessly, for I feared for the worst, and springing up I drew aside the soft pelt which she had wrapped around Fufkuja, and there he lay, dead. Poor little beast, he had been so happy to crawl into the arms of one he loved so dearly, and had cuddled up closer and closer to her in search of greater warmth, but only to come nearer and nearer to a heart that could not warm him, and so the insidious chill of death, which bringeth sweet and pleasant drowsiness with it, had stole over him and he had died. And Schneebaul's tears, freezing as they fell, now showered like a gentle hail of tiny gems upon the little dead beast, no longer Fufkuja, but once again the little man with the frozen smile. Presently the Coltiquerps recovered from their senseless fear, and first one by one, and then group-wise, they returned to their homes, King Gelidus and his court coming back to the fair palace which he had abandoned in their wild fright when the cry had gone up that the little baron was burning. Everybody was sorry to hear that Fufkuja had died the second time, and many were the frozen tears that dropped from the chilly cheeks of the Coltiquerps as they looked upon the little man with the frozen smile as he lay on the white pelt beside the Princess Schneebaul. That day we bore him back to the ice grotto, and having laid him in the hollow moulded by his body in the crystal block, it was closed again so skillfully by the king's quarryman that no eye was keen enough to note where the cleavage had been. And the same uncanny glint was in his eyes, and when the Coltiquerps saw this their icy hearts felt a cold shiver of satisfaction, for not only was the little man with the frozen smile back in his crystal cell again, but all the fears and dreadful fancies which his coming to life again had given rise to were past and gone forever, and peace and quiet and sweet contentment reigned throughout the icy realm of his frigid majesty Gelidus, king of the Coltiquerps. Now nothing remained to make his cold heart crack with joy but to see his beloved child Schneebaul make choice of a husband. And he had not long to wait, for one day upon entering the palace she saw a youth lying at the foot of the stairway overcome with sleep. In one hand he held an alabaster lamp, and in the other a new wick which he was about to fit into it, for the youth was a lamp trimmer in the ice palace of King Gelidus, and when the Princess Schneeball saw him lying there overcome with sleep, she stooped and kissed him on the cheek, and passed on without another thought about the matter, one way or the other. And the kiss froze on the cheek of the lamp trimmer, where Schneeball had pressed it. Presently King Gelidus came tramping into the hallway with his breath white upon his beard, and he saw the youth lying there, and the frozen kiss on his cheek, and he bade Glaciobhoy scrape the delicate frost crystals from the youth's face with a blade of polished horn. "Vividest there, father of mine?" asked the princess, when she saw him bearing the blade of horn along so carefully. "A kiss which someone pressed upon the cheek of one of my lamp trimmers, now lying on the staircase overcome with sleep," replied King Gelidus, in ringing, icy tones. "Vvhy, father of mine," exclaimed Princess Schneeball, "now that thou speakest of it, I really believe the kiss is mine, for I recollect kissing someone as I entered the palace. I was deep in thought, but no doubt the youth pleased me as he lay there, asleep with lamp in one hand and wick in the other. And that lamp trimmer trimmed no more lamps in the ice palace of his frigid majesty Gelidus, king of the Coltiquerps. No doubt he made Schneeball a very good husband, and I'm quite sure that she made him a good wife. I would have been glad to tarry for the nuptial feast, but that was out of the question. I had stayed too long already. Chapter 29. Something concerning the many portals to the icy domain of King Gelidus and the difficult task of choosing the right one. How Bulger solved it. Our farewell to the cold-blooded Coltiquerps. Schneeball's sorrow at losing us. As Bully Brain had once remarked, when there are many doors it's a wise man who knows which is the right one to open, and this I found to be the case when I attempted to take my departure from the icy domain of his frigid majesty, Gelidus, king of the Coltiquerps, for there was a baker's dozen of galleries, in each of which, upon exploring it, I came, after a tramp of half a mile or so, up against a lofty gate of solid ice, curiously carved and fitting the end of the gallery as a cork does a bottle. No doubt you are wondering why I didn't make my way out of the Coltiquerpian kingdom by following the river, for the very good reason that it went no farther than King Gelidus's domain, emptying into a vast reservoir which apparently had a subterranean outlet, for its thick covering of ice always remained at the same height. The king's quarrymen were ordered to hew an opening through whichever door I should point out as the one that I wished to pass through, but I was informed by Frostifiz that according to the law of the land but one door could be opened during any 1 year, so that if I found my way blocked and turned back again it would mean a delay of 12 months. Bully Brain, with all his wisdom, was powerless to assist me, although I was half inclined to think that he might have done so had he been permitted to investigate the secret records of the kingdom, carved upon huge tablets of ice, and stored away in the vaults of the palace. The fact of the matter is King Gelidus was so desirous of having me assist at the marriage feast of Princess Schneeball, that he threw every obstacle in my way that he could, without openly showing his hand. And Schneeball herself by the dancing of her clear grey eyes gave me to understand that she, too, was hoping that I would make a mistake when I came to point out the door which I wanted opened. Bulger saw that I was in trouble, but couldn't comprehend clearly what that trouble was. He kept his eyes fastened upon me, however, watching my every movement, hoping, no doubt, to solve the mystery. While sitting one day lost in thought over the very serious problem which I found myself called upon to solve, an idea struck me. I had noticed that in the meat quarries, the workmen often made use of sounding rods, which were long pieces of polished bone, ending in flint tips. A Coltiquerpian quarryman, by dexterously twisting this rod, was able to bore a hole 6 feet deep or more into the solid bed of ice when desirous of ascertaining the position of a carcass in the meat quarry, and it occurred to me that by piercing the portals of ice which closed their various corridors I have spoken of, possibly Bulger's keen scent might recognize that current of air which would have in it the odor of earth and rock, in other words, make choice for me of the portal which opened on that corridor leading away from the icy domain of King Gelidus and not merely into some outlying chamber of his kingdom. His frigid majesty could not object to such experiments, for the law only forbade the hewing of openings large enough for the hewer to pass through. King Gelidus and half a dozen of his courtiers, looking stern and frigid and conversing in freezing tones, were present to see the experiment tried. Without their icy lips clacked together with satisfaction when, at my request, one portal after another was pierced, but Bulger, after sniffing at the hole, turned away with a bewildered look in his eyes as if he didn't half understand why I was ordering him to thrust his warm nose into such cold places. And so we tramped from corridor to corridor, until the quarrymen began to show signs of fatigue, and the sounding rod turned slower and slower in their hands. Frostifizz blinked his cold grey eyes as much as to say, "Little Baron, thou must bide with us for another year." But I merely turned to the quarrymen, and ordered them to pierce one more portal of ice ere we abandoned the task for the day. They went at the work of piercing the 11th door with the pace of pack mules up a mountainside. But at last the sounding rod bored a way through, and at a wave of my hand the quarryman fell back. In an instant Bulger had his nose at the hole, and took 3 or 4 quick, nervous sniffs, ending with a long, deep-drawn one, and then breaking out into a string of sharp, jerky, joyful barks. He began scratching furiously at the bottom of the portal. "Your frigid majesty," said I, with a low and stately bend of my body such as only those born to the manner can make, "by this portal, at the coming of tomorrow's sun, I shall pass from your majesty's icy dominion." And when Frostifizz and Glaciobhoy heard these words of mine uttered so loftily, their eyes gleamed cold as steel, and they followed the king in silence back to the palace of ice. Schneeball met them in the grand hallway, and when she had looked upon their faces she began to weep, for she loved me and she loved Bulger too, and her cold little heart could not bear the thought of our going. Coltiquerpian quarryman hewing a passage through the wall of ice. King Gelidus, however, soon recovered his spirits, and ordered a feast with song and dance in honor of Bulger, who during the festivities sat on the highest divan with the softest pelt beneath him, and so many were the frozen tidbits which the Coltiquerps presented to him during the progress of the feast, that I grew alarmed lest he might overload his stomach and not be in a fit condition to make the early start on our journey, of which I had given notice to the Coltiquerpian monarch. But his good sense saved him from doing so foolish a thing. In fact, I was greatly amused to see that, while he accepted every tidbit handed to him, and solemnly went through the motions of chewing it, yet watching his chance, he slyly dropped it out of his mouth and flirted it aside with his paw. Thus was spent our last night at the icy court of his frigid majesty, and on the morrow the Coltiquerps collected in great crowds on the different terraces to say goodbye. I pressed a kiss on the cheek of Princess Schneeball, and when it had turned to ice crystals, one of her men brushed it into an alabaster box. Prince Chilikopes, the former lamp trimmer, was on hand with the rest of the Coltiquerpian nobles, but I flattered myself that Schneeball loved me better than she did him. However, I wished him joy, and gripped his cold palm with such warmth that he stood blowing it for a whole minute. Then we reached the lofty portal. We found that the quarryman had already hewn a passage through it, and nearby I observed a pile of massive blocks of ice, crystal clear. These, when Bulger and I should pass through the opening, were to be used in walling it up again, and when I saw this pile of blocks, and remembered the solid workmanship of the Coltiquerpian quarryman, the thought flitted through my mind, suppose Bulger hath not chosen wisely, what use would there be in turning back? For my own weak hands would be powerless against a wall built of such blocks, and knock I ever so loud, how could the sound ever traverse this long and winding corridor and reach the ear of a Coltiquerp? No, said I to myself, if Bulger hath not chosen wisely, it will be goodbye to both upper and under worlds. And then, bearing an alabaster lamp in one hand and in the other holding the cord which I had tied to Bulger's collar, I stepped through the narrow passage hewn by the quarryman, and turned my back forever on the cold dominion of Gelidus, king of the Coltiquerps. Once I halted and looked back. I could see nothing, but I could hear the sharp click of the flint axes as the quarryman closed up the door that shut me out from so many cold but loving hearts. And then I drew a long breath and went on my way again. And that was the last I ever saw of the Coltiquerps, save in daydream or night vision. The Wonderful Ride on the Block of Ice. Chapter 30. All about the most terrible but magnificent ride one ever took in my miles on the back of a flying mass of ice, and how Bulger and one were landed at last on the banks of a most wonderful river. How the day broke in this underworld. Had my hand at that moment not grasped a cord tied to the neck of my wise and keen-eyed Bulger, I really believe I would have come to a halt, faced about, retraced my steps, and begged the inhabitants of this crystal realm to admit me once more into the cold kingdom where Gelidus held his icy court, for a sudden fit of depression came upon me as the chilly air struck against my cheeks and I saw the deep darkness made visible by the tiny flame of my alabaster lamp. Cold though it might be, I would have sunshine in the icy land of the Coltiquerps, but now how could I tell what fate awaited me? Luckily, I had asked the captain of the meat quarries to allow me to retain one of his sounding rods with its flint point, for I feared lest in descending some icy declivity I might fall and bruise, or even break, a limb. I was determined to advance cautiously along this icy passage, shrouded as it was in impenetrable gloom, and so different from the broad and polished pavement of the marble highway, and hence, hanging the lamp about my neck, I proceeded to make use of the sounding rod as an alpenstock, for which purposes it was admirably adapted. Suddenly Bulger halted, gave a whine of warning, and turned back. In an instant I knew that there was danger ahead, and, letting myself drop on my hands and knees, crawled carefully along to make an investigation of the dangerous spot in our route signalled by the watchful Bulger. It was only too true, we stood apparently upon the very edge of a sheer parapet, how high I had no way of ascertaining, but I was unable to reach any bottom with the sounding rod. Vivat was to be done. Turn back. It was not yet too late. The Coltiquerpian quarrymen could not have completed their task in so short a time. They would hear my knock, they would tear down their wall of ice, and Gelidus and Schneeball would welcome us back to their ice palace with a cold, but honest satisfaction. As I sat there plunged in thought, I half unconsciously began to twirl the sounding rod around until I had sunk it half its length into the floor of ice, and then reaching out I encircled Bulger with my arm and drew him up against me as was my wont when preparing for profound meditation. I had scarcely done so when the ice beneath me gave one of those sharp, clear, cracking noises so unlike the sound made by the breaking of any other substance, and thereupon I felt the crystal mass on which Bulger and I were sitting tremble and vibrate for an instant, and then, with a sudden downward cant, break away from the mass behind it and begin to move. Instinctively a sense of my awful peril prompted me to cling to the sounding rod which I had sunk drill-like into the ice. Luckily it was between my legs, and quick as a flash I entwined them around it, assuming a Turkish sitting posture, while my left arm was wrapped tightly around Bulger's body. I don't know how it was done as it was all in an instant, but there I sat now firmly saddled, so to speak, upon that crystal monster's back, as with a creak and a crash it snapped the crystal links which bound it to the wall of ice and plunged headlong down the glassy slope. In my fright I had dropped my lamp, and now the deep gloom of this underworld enwrapped me. But no, it was not so, for as the escaping block of ice creaked and crunched its way along, the two cold crystal surfaces gave forth a weird glimmer of phosphorescent light which made the flying mass seem like a monstrous living thing, out of whose 1,000 eyes were darting tongues of flame as it rushed madly along, now gaining speed upon striking a steeper stretch of way, now fouling with some obstruction and dashing against the rocky sides of the corridor, and sending a shower of crystals sparkling and glittering in the black air. Anon the escaping block comes upon a gentle slope, and with the music of crushing crystals slips softly along in its flight as if mounted upon runners of polished steel, and then with a sudden dip it glides upon a sharper descent and fairly leaps into the air as it bounds along, hissing over the slippery roadway, and leaving a train of fire behind it. And now it strikes a stretch of way piled here and there with clumps and blocks of ice. With a mad fury it springs upon the lesser ones with a growl of rage, grinding them to powder, which, like showers of icy foam, it hurls upon Bulger and me seated on its back. But some of the blocks resist its terrible onslaught, and our mighty steed is hurled from side to side with crash and creak, as it drives its crystal corners fiercely against the jutting rocks, leaving marks of its white flesh on these black heads of adamant. It seems an hour since the crystal monster broke away, and yet ever downward he threads his wild flight, butting, bumping, jostling, veering, staggering along, bearing Bulger and me to the lowest level of the world within a world. Will he never end his mad flight? Is there no way for me to curb him? Must he fly until he has ground his very body to such a thinness that the next obstruction will shatter it into 10,000 pieces, and hurl Bulger and me to death? As these thoughts are flitting through my mind, the flying mass takes one last mad plunge which lands it on an almost level stretch of roadway, and by the different sound given out by the sliding block, I know that we have left the regions of ice behind us, and that our crystal sledge is gliding gently along over a track of polished marble. But, mile after mile, it still glides along, gently, softly, silently, and then I dare to think that our lives are saved. But so terrible had been the strain, so fearful the anxiety, so exhausting the effort necessary to hold my place on the block of ice, and keep my beloved Bulger from slipping out of my arms, that I fell backward into a dead faint as the gliding mass came, at last, to a standstill. I think I must have lain there a good half hour or so, for when I came to myself Bulger's frantic joy told me that he had been terribly wrought up over me, and the moment I opened my eyes he began to shower caresses on my hands and face in most lover-like style. Dear, grateful heart, he felt that he owed his life this time to his little master, and he wanted me to understand how thankful he was. The moment Bulger's nerves had recovered from the shock occasioned by my prolonged faint, I reached for my repeater and touched its spring. It registered 1 hour and a half since we had stepped through the icy portal of King Gelidus' domain. Allowing a half hour for the time I lay unconscious, it showed that our mad descent on the back of the crystal monster had lasted quite a full hour, and reckoning the average speed of the escaping mass of ice to have been 1.5 miles a minute, that we were now in the neighborhood of 90 miles away from the cold kingdom where Gelidus sat on his icy throne, and Princess Schneeball at his feet with Chilicopes beside her. It was with great difficulty that I could rise to my feet, so stiffened were my joints and knotted my muscles after that terrible ride, every instant of which I expected to be dashed to pieces against projecting rocks, or torn to shreds by being caught between the fleeing monster of ice and the gigantic icicles hanging from the ceiling like the shining teeth of some huge creature of this underworld. The tropics of the underworld. But could it be, dear friends, that Bulger and I had only escaped a quick and merciful ending to be brought face to face with a death 10 times more terrible, in that it was to be slow and gradual, denied even the poor boon of looking upon each other, for darkness impenetrable was folded about us and silence so deep that my ears ached in their longing for some sound to break it. And yet there was something in the sound of my own voice that startled me when I used it. It seemed as if the awful stillness were angered at being disturbed by it, and smote it back into my teeth. Where are we? His was the question I put to myself, and then in my mind I strove to recall every word which I had read in the musty pages of Don Fum's manuscript concerning the world within a world, but I could recollect nothing to enlighten me, not a word to give me hope or cheer, and I was about to cry out in utter despair when, happening to raise my eyes and look off in the distance, I saw what seemed to me to be a jack-o'-lantern dancing along on the ground. It was a strange and fantastic sight in this region of inky darkness, and for a moment I stood watching it with bated breath and wide-opened eyes, but no, it could not be a will-o'-the-wisp, for now the faint and uncertain glimmer had increased to a mild but steady glow, reaching away off in the distance like a long line of dying campfires seen through an enveloping mist. But in a moment's time this wide encircling ring of light had so increased in brightness that it looked for all the world like a break o' day in the land o' sunshine, and here and there where its mild effulgence overcame the darkness of this subterranean region, I caught sight of walls and arches and columns of snow-white marble. And then as I called to mind Don Fum's mysterious reference to sunrise in the lower world I swung my hat and gave a loud cry of joy, while Bulger waked the echoes of these spacious caverns by his barking. I tell you, dear friends, not until you have been in just such a plight can you know just how such a rescue feels. And now, no doubt, you are a bit anxious to know what sort of a sunrise could possibly take place in this underworld miles below our well, when you have travelled as many miles as I have, and seen as many wonders as I have, you will be ready to admit that wonders are quite as commonplace itself. Know, then, that this vast region of the world within a world was girt round about by a broad and placid stream whose waters swarmed with vast numbers of gigantic radiate animals, such as polyps, sea urchins, Portuguese men of war, sea anemones, and the like, that these transparent creatures, which had the power of emitting light, after lying dormant for 12 hours, gradually unfolded their bodies and tentacles, and rose toward the surface of these calm and limpid waters, increasing by degrees their mysterious radiance, until they had chased the darkness from the vast caverns opening upon the banks of the river, and lighted up this underworld with a soft effulgence somewhat brighter than the rays of our full moon. For 12 hours these weird lanterns of the stream made it day for this nether world, and then, as they gradually shrank together and sank out of sight, their expiring fires glowed with all the multicoloured radiance of our fairest twilight, and the night, blacker than Stygian darkness, came back again. But now 'twas full daylight, and bidding Bulger follow me I walked in silent wonder along the banks of this glowing stream, which, like a band of mysterious fire, as far as my eye could reach went circling around the white marble mouths of these vast underground chambers. Chapter 31. In which you read of the glorious caverns of white marble fronting on the wonderful river. In the tropics of the underworld. How we came upon a solitary wanderer on the banks of the river. My conversation with him, and my joy at finding myself in the land of the rattle brains, or happy forgetters. Brief description of them. With every turn in the winding way that skirted the white shores of this wonderful stream, its swarms of light-emitting animals lent it a new beauty, for as the day advanced, if I may so express it, they lifted their glowing bodies nearer and nearer to the surface, until now the river shone like molten silver, and as the sheer walls of rock on the opposite bank held set in them vast slabs of mica, the effect was that these gigantic natural mirrors reflected the glowing stream with startling fidelity, and threw the flood of soft light in dazzling shimmer against the fantastic portals of the white marble caverns on this side of the stream. It was a scene never to forget, and again I paused in silent wonder to feast my eyes upon some newly discovered beauty. Now, for the first, I noted that every white marble basin of cove and inlet was filled with a different glow, according to the nature of the tiny phosphorescent animals which happened to fill its waters, one being a delicate pink, another a glorious red, the third a deep rich purple, the fourth a soft blue, the fifth a golden yellow, and so on, the charm of each tint being greatly enhanced by the snowy whiteness of these marble basins, through which long lines of curious fish scaled in hues of polished gold and silver swam slowly along, turning up their glorious sides to catch the full splendor of the light reflected from the mica mirrors. And now the chilly breath of King Gelidus' domain no longer filled the air. I stood in the tropics of the underworld, so to speak, and but one thing was lacking to make my enjoyment of this fairy region complete, and that was someone to share it with me. True, Bulger had an idea of its beauty, for he testified his happiness at being once more in a warm land by executing some mad capers for my amusement, and by scampering along the shore of the glowing river and barking at the stately fish as they slowly fanned the water with their many-coloured fins, but I must admit that I longed for the Princess Schneeball to keep me company. But it was a rash wish, for the warm air would have thrown her into convulsions of fear, and she would have preferred to meet her death in the cool river rather than attempt to breathe such a fiery atmosphere. By this time I had advanced several miles along the white shores of the glowing stream, and, feeling somewhat fatigued, I was about to sit down on the jutting edge of a natural bench of rock, which seemed almost placed on the river banks by human hands for human forms to rest upon and watch the wonderful play of tints and hues in this wide sweeping inlet, when, to my amazement, I saw that a human creature was already sitting there. His eyes were fixed upon the water, and methought that his face, which was gentle and placid, wore a tired look. Certainly he was plunged into such deep meditation that he either took or feigned to take no notice of my approach. Bulger was inclined to dash forward and attract his attention by a string of ear-splitting barks, but I shook my head. This wanderer along the glowing stream of day wore rather a graceful cloak-like garment, woven of some substance that shimmered in the light, and so I concluded that it must be mineral wool. His head was bare, and so were his legs to the knees, his feet being shod with white metal sandals tied on with what looked like leathern thongs. All in all, he had a friendly though somewhat peculiar look about him, and his attitude struck me as being that of a person either plunged into deep thought, or possibly listening for some anxiously expected signal. At any rate, accustomed as I was to meet all sorts of people on my travels in the four corners of the globe, I determined to make bold enough to interrupt the gentleman's meditations and wish him good morrow. Through the revolving door. Vivum have I the pleasure of meeting in this beautiful section of the world within a world. The man looked at me in a dazed sort of way and replied, I really don't know, I'm happy to say. But, sir, thy name? I insisted. Forgot it years ago, was his remarkable answer. But surely, sir, I exclaimed rather testily, thou art not the sole inhabitant of this beautiful underest kinsman, wife, family. Gentle stranger, he replied in slow and measured tones, there are people farther along the shore, and they are good, dear souls, although I have forgotten their names, and I have, too, a very faint recollection that two of those people are sons of mine. Stop. No, their names are gone from me too, I forgot them the day my own name slipped from my mind, and as he uttered these words he threw his head back with a sudden jerk, and I heard a strange click inside of it, as if something had slipped from its place, and that instant a mysterious expression used by that master of masters, Don Fum, flashed through my mind. Rattlebrains. Yes, that was it, and now I felt sure that I was standing in the presence of one of the curious folk inhabiting the world within a world, to whom Don Fum had given the strange name of Rattlebrains, or Happy Forgetters. I was so delighted that I could barely keep myself from rushing up to this gentle-visaged and mild-mannered person, whose head had just given forth the sharp click, and grasping him by the hand. But I feared to shock him by such a friendly greeting, and so I contented myself with crying out, Sir, thou seest before thee none other than the famous traveller, Baron Sebastian von Trump, but to my great amazement and greater chagrin he simply turned his strange eyes, with the faraway look, upon me for an instant, and then resumed his contemplation of the beautifully tinted sheet of water, as if I hadn't opened my mouth. It was the most extraordinary treatment that I had experienced since my descent into the underworld, and I was upon the point of resenting it, as became a true knight and especially a von Trump, when Don Fum's brief description of the Rattlebrains, or Happy Forgetters, flitted through my mind. Said he, by the exercise of their strong wills they have been busy for ages striving to unload their brains of the to them now useless stock of knowledge accumulated by their ancestors, and the natural consequence has been that the brains of these curious folk, who call themselves the Happy Forgetters, relieved of all labour and strain of thought, have absolutely shrunken rather than increased in size, so that with many of the Happy Forgetters their brains are like the shriveled kernel of last year's nut and give forth a sharp click when they move their heads suddenly with a jerk, as is often their wont, for they take great pride in proving to the listener that they deserve the name of Rattlebrain. Nor do I need remind thee, O reader, concluded Don Fum, in his celebrated work on the world within a world, that the chiefest among the Happy Forgetters is the man whose head gives forth the loudest and sharpest click, for he it is who has forgotten most. You can have but a faint idea, dear friends, of my delight at the prospect of spending some time among these curious people who look with absolute dread upon knowledge as the one thing necessary to get rid of before happiness can enter the human heart. No joy can equal the Happy Forgetters when, upon clasping a friend's hand, he finds that he has forgotten his very name, and no day is well spent in this land at the close of which the inhabitant may not exclaim, this day I succeeded in forgetting something that I knew yesterday. At last the Happy Forgetter rose from his seat and calmly walked away, without so much as wishing me good day, but I was resolved not to be so easily gotten rid of, so I called after him in a loud voice, and Bulger, following my example, raised a racket at his heels, whereupon he faced about and remarked, "Beg pardon, I had quite forgotten thee, I'm happy to say, and thy name too, I've forgotten that, let me see, art thou a radiate? One of the animals in the water. I was more than half inclined to lose my temper at this slur, classing me, a backboned animal, with a mere jellyfish, but under all the circumstances I thought it best to control myself, for I could well imagine that from the size of my head and the utter absence of all click inside of it, I was not destined to be a very welcome visitor among the happy forgetters, and therefore, swallowing my injured feelings, I made a very low bow, and begged this curious gentleman to be kind enough to conduct me to his people, among whom I wished to abide for a few days. Chapter 32. How we entered the land of the happy forgetters. Something more about these curious folk, their dread of Bulger and me. Only a stay of 1 day accorded us. Description of the PLEASANR homes of the happy forgetters. The revolving door through which Bulger and one are unceremoniously set outside of the domain of the Exitler brains. All about the extraordinary things which happened to Bulger and me thereafter. Once more in the open air of the upper world, and then homeward bound. The happy forgetter pursued his way calmly along the winding path that skirted the glowing river, apparently, and no doubt really, unconscious of the fact that Bulger and I were following close at his heels. After half an hour or so of this silent tramp, he suddenly came to a standstill, and with his placid countenance turned toward the light seemed to be so far away in thought that for several moments I hesitated to address him. But as there were no signs of his showing any disposition to come to himself, I made bold to ask him the cause of the delay. "I'm happy to say," he remarked, without so much as deigning to turn his head, "that I've forgotten which of these 2 roads leads to the homes of our people." Well, this was a pleasant outlook to be sure, and I don't know what we should have done had not Bulger solved the difficulty for us by making choice of one of the paths and dashing on ahead with a bark of encouragement for us to follow. Caught up in the arms of the torrent, Vive and I assured the happy forgetter that he need have no fear as to the wisdom of the choice. He gave a start of almost horror at the information, for you must know, dear friends, that the happy forgetter has more dread of knowledge than we have of ignorance. To him it is the mother of all discontent, the source of all unhappiness, the cause of all the dreadful ills that have come upon the world, and the people in it. "The world," said one of the happy forgetters to me sadly, "was perfectly happy once, and man had no name for his brother, and yet he loved him even as the turtle dove loves his mate, although he has no names to call her by. But, alas, one day this happiness came to an end, for a strange malady broke out among the people. They were seized with a wild desire to invent names for things, even many names for the same thing, and different ways of doing the same thing. This strange passion so grew upon them that they spent their lives in making them in every possible way harder to live. They built different roads to the same place, they made different clothes for different days, and different dishes for different feasts. To each child they gave 2, 3, and even 4 different names, and different shoes were fashioned for different feet, and one family was no longer satisfied with one drinking gourd. Did they stop here? Nay, they now busied themselves learning how to make different faces to different friends, covering a frown with a smile, and singing gay songs when their hearts were sad. In a few centuries a brother could no longer read a brother's face, and one half the world went about wondering what the other half was thinking about, hence arose misunderstandings, quarrels, feuds, warfare. Man was no longer content to dwell with his fellow man in the spacious caverns which kind nature had hollowed out for him, piercing the mountains with winding passages beside which his narrow streets dwindled to merest pathways. In the land of the happy forgetters care never comes to trouble sleep, nor anxious thought to wear the dread mask of tomorrow. Happy the day on which this child of nature might exclaim, "Since morn I've forgotten something. I've unloaded my mind. It's one thought lighter than it was." he was the happiest of the happy forgetters who could honestly say, I know not thy name, nor when thou wast born, not where thou dwellest, nor who thy kinsmen are, I only know that thou art my brother, and that thou wilt not see me suffer if I should forget to eat, or perish of thirst if I forget to drink, and that thou wilt bid me close my eyes if I should forget that I had laid me down to sleep. Bulger's and my arrival in the land of the happy forgetters filled the hearts of these curious folk with secret dread. At sight of my large head they all began to tremble like children in the dark, stricken with fear of bogey or goblin, and with one voice they refused to permit me to sojourn a single brief half-hour among them. But gradually this sudden terror passed off a bit, and after a council held by a few of the younger men, whose brains as yet completely filled their heads, it was determined that I might bide for another day in their land, but that then the revolving door should be opened, and Bulger and I be thrust outside of their domain. From what Don Fum had written about the happy forgetters, I knew only too well that it would be useless for me to attempt to reverse this decree, so I held my peace, except to thank them for this great favour shown me. The daylight, if I may call it so, now began to wane, or rather the thousands of light-giving creatures swarming in the river now began to draw in their long tentacles, close their flower-like bodies, and slowly sink to the bottom of the stream. I was quite anxious to see whether the happy forgetters would make any attempt to light up their cavernous homes, or whether they would simply creep off to bed and sleep out the long hours of pitchy darkness. To my surprise, I now heard the clicking of flints on all sides, and in a moment or so 1,000 or more great candles made of mineral wax with asbestos wicks were lighted, and the great chambers of white marble were soon aglow with these soft and steady flames. The happy forgetters were strictly vegetable eaters, feeding upon the various fungus plants growing in these caverns in great profusion, together with a very nutritious and pleasant-tasting jelly made from a hardened gum of vegetable origin which abounded in the crevices of certain rocks. There was still another source of food, namely, the nests of certain shellfish, which they built against the face of the rock, just above the surface of the river. These dissolved in boiling water made an excellent broth, very much like the soup from edible birds' nests. The clothes worn by the happy forgetters were entirely woven from mineral wool, which in these caverns gave a long and strong fibre of astonishing softness. The rattlebrains were tolerably good metal workers too, but contented themselves with fashioning only such articles as were actually necessary for daily use. Their beds were stuffed with dried seaweed and lichens, and Bulger and I passed a very comfortable night. As I was forbidden to speak aloud, to ask a question, or to walk abroad unless in company with one of the select men, I was not sorry when the moment came for the revolving door to be opened. The happy forgetters had been led to believe that Bulger and I were 1,000 times more dangerous than scaly monsters or black-winged vampires, and hence they held themselves aloof from us, the children hiding behind their mothers, and the mothers peering through crack and crevice at us. The size of my head inspired them with a nameless dread, and even the half a dozen of the younger and more courageous drew aside instinctively to let me pass. For the first time in my life I was an object of horror to my fellow creatures, but I had no hard thoughts against them. Timid children of nature that they were, to them I was as terrible an object as the torch-armed demon of destruction would be to us were he let loose in one of our fair cities of the upper world. And now the guard of happy forgetters had halted in front of what seemed to me to be a huge cask fashioned of solid marble, and sea-tone half within the white wall of the cavern to which they had led me. But on second glance I saw that there was a row of square holes around its bulge, like those in the top of a capstan. The happy forgetters now disappeared for a moment, and when they joined me again each bore in hand a metal bar, the end of which he set in one of these holes, and then at a signal from the leader the huge half-circle of marble began to turn noiselessly around, exactly like a capstan. As each man's lever came to the wall, he shifted it to the front again. Suddenly, to my amazement, I saw that the great marble cask was hollow, like a sentry box, and you may judge of my feelings, dear friends, upon being politely requested to step inside. Did I refuse to obey? Not I. It would have been useless, for was not the whole tribe of rattlebrains there to lay hands upon me and thrust me in? So taking off my hat and making a low bow to the little group of happy forgetters, I stepped within the hollow cask, and Bulger did the same, but not with so good a grace as his master, for, casting an angry glance at the inhospitable dwellers in these chambers of white marble, he growled and laid bare his teeth to show his contempt for them. Now the great marble cask began to revolve the other way, and in a moment it was back in place again. I heard several sharp clicks as if a number of huge spring latches had snapped into place, and then all was silent as the tomb, and I had almost said as dark too, but no, I could not say that, for I looked out into a IO tunnel which ran past the niche in which Bulger and I were standing, and to my more than wonder it was dimly lighted. Hurled out in the sunshine. I stepped out into it. It was as round as a cannonball and just high enough for me to stand erect, and now I discovered whence the light proceeded. In the cracks and crevices of its walls grew vast masses of those delicate light-giving fungus rootlets, the glow of which was so strong that I had no difficulty in reading the emitting on my tablets. In fact, I stood there for several minutes making entries by the light of these bunches of glowing rootlets. Then the thought dashed through my mind, which way shall I turn, to the right or to the left? Bulger comprehended the cause of my vacillation and made haste to come to my rescue. After sniffing the air, first in one direction and then in the other, he chose the right hand, and I followed without a thought of questioning his wisdom. Strange to say, he had not advanced more than a few hundred rods before I noticed that there was a strong current of air blowing through the tunnel in the direction Bulger had taken. Every moment it increased in violence, fairly lifting us from our feet and bearing us along through this narrow ball made by nature's own hands and lighted too by lamps of her own fashioning. The motion of the air through this vast pipe caused bursts of mighty tones as if pealed forth by some gigantic organ played by giant hands. It was strange, but yet I felt no terror as I listened to this unearthly music, although its depth of tone jarred painfully upon my eardrums. By the dim light of the luminous rootlets, I could see Bulger just ahead of me, and I was content. No shiver of fear ran down my back, or robbed my limbs of their full power to resist the ever-increasing pressure of the air. But as it grew stronger and stronger, half of my own accord and half because Bulger set the example, I broke into a run. Our pace once quickened, it was impossible for me to slow up again. On, in a mad race, my feet scarcely touching the bottom of the tunnel, I sped along, while the great pipe through which I was borne on the very wings of the gale sent forth its deep and majestic peal. There was something strangely and mysteriously exciting in this race, and all that kept me from enjoying it to my full bent was the thought that a sudden increase in the violence of the blast might toss me violently on my face and possibly break an arm for me or injure me in some serious way. All at once the deep pealing forth of the organ-like tone ceased, and in its stead came the awful sound of rushing water. Before I had time to think, it was upon me, striking me like a terrific blow from some gigantic fist wearing a boxing glove. The next instant I was caught up like a cork on a mountain torrent, swayed from side to side, twisted, turned, sucked down and cast up again, whirled over and over, tossed and tumbled, rolled along like a wheel, my arms and legs the spokes. Wonderful to relate, I did not lose consciousness as this terrible current shot me like a stick of timber through a flume, whither I knew not, only that the speed and volume went ever on increasing until at last the tumultuous torrent filled the tunnel, and robbed me of light, of breath, of life, of everything, including my faithful and loving Bulger. How long it lasted, this fearful ride in the arms of these mad waters, rushing as if for life or death through this narrow bore, I know not. I only know that my ears were suddenly assailed with a mighty whiz and rush of water as through the nozzle of some gigantic hose, and that I was shot out into the glorious sunshine, out into the grand, free, open air of the upper world, and sent flying up toward the dear, blue sky with its flecks of fleecy cloudlets, and Bulger some 20 feet ahead of me. And that then, with a gracefully curved flight through the soft and balmy air of harvest time, we both were gently dropped into a quiet little lake nestled at the foot of a hillside yellow with ripened corn. In a moment or so we had swum ashore. Bulger wanted to halt and shake the water from his thick coat, but I couldn't wait for that. Wet as he was, I clasped him to my heart while he showered caresses on me. But not a word was said, not a sound was uttered. We were both of us too happy to speak, and if you have ever been in that state, dear friends, you know how it feels. I can't describe it to you. At this moment some men and boys clad in the garb of the Russian peasant came racing across the fields to see what I was about, no doubt, for I had stripped off my heavy outside clothing, and was spreading it out in the sun to dry. Upon sight of these red-cheeked children of the upper world I was so overcome with joy that for a minute or so I couldn't get a syllable across my lips, but making a great effort I cried out, "Fathers! Brothers! Where am I? Speak! Dear souls!" "In northeastern Siberia," little soul, replied the eldest of the party, "not far from the banks of the Obi, but whence comest thou?" "By St. Nicholas, I believe thou wast spit out of the spouting well." "What art thou doing here alone?" I paid no attention to the question. I was thinking of something else of more importance to me, to wit, my splendid achievement, the marvellous underground journey I had just completed, fully 500 miles in length, passing completely under the Ural Mountains. After a short stay at the nearest village, I engaged the best guide that was to be had, and crossing the Urals by the pass in the most direct line, re-entered Russia and made haste to join the first government train on its way to St. Petersburg. Having dispatched an avant courier with letters to my beloved parents, informing them of my good health and whereabouts, I passed several weeks very pleasantly in the Russian capital, and then by easy stages set out for home. The elder Baron came as far as Riga to meet me, and brought me the best of news from Castle Trump, that my dear mother was in perfect health, and that she and every man, woman, and child in and about the castle were anxiously waiting to give me a real German welcome back home again. And here, dear friends, mit Herrlichen Gruß, Bulger and I take our leave of you. The end.